What if one of the strangest things about being human is something we almost never question at all among nearly all mammals? Fur is survival. It protects, insulates, hides, and endures. So why did humans give it up? Why did our ancestors become one of the most exposed, vulnerable, and biologically unusual creatures on Earth? Was it the heat of ancient Africa, the rise of endurance hunting, disease, evolution, or something even stranger before we go deeper? Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of how humans lost their fur is also the story of how humans became human. The wind moves first. It passes over a dry African plain where the grass bends in long pale waves, where heat rises in visible tremors from stone and dust, where every living thing must solve the same hard problem before noon: how to keep from cooking alive under an open sky. Out here, fur is usually part of the answer. Fur shields the skin, softens the sun, protects against cold nights, biting insects, thorns, and sudden weather. Fur is old, proven, and everywhere. The antelope carries it. The hyena carries it. The baboon carries it. Even the apes in the forest shade carry it. And yet sooner or later, among one small line of upright African primates, something extraordinary begins to happen. The coat thins. The body beneath starts to emerge. Dark skin glints with sweat. The back, chest, arms, and legs become less like those of any ordinary mammal and more like something unfinished, almost exposed, almost vulnerable, as if evolution has made a mistake and then refused to correct it. That is the mystery. Humans are not truly naked, not in the absolute sense. Fine hair still covers much of the body, and in some places hair remains thick and important, but compared with almost every other large land mammal, the human body is startlingly bare. A seal looks smoother, an elephant looks more naked from a distance, yet both still carry their own version of protective covering and live within very different physical rules. Humans, by contrast, belong to a branch of primates whose close relatives remain visibly furred. Chimpanzees are hairy, gorillas are hairy, orangutans are hairy, monkeys nearly everywhere are hairy. Move backward through the mammalian family tree and the pattern becomes even more obvious. Hair is not some decorative extra. It is one of the defining features of the group. Mammals are, in effect, the furry animals. And then there is the human exception, walking through history wrapped not in fur but in tools, fire, shelter, clothing, and culture, as though biology surrendered a basic protection and handed the debt to the mind. That alone would make the story strange enough, but it becomes stranger the longer one looks. Hairlessness, or near hairlessness, usually evolves in very particular situations. Marine mammals streamline their bodies for water. Huge animals such as elephants can afford to lose much of their coat because their immense bulk changes how they manage heat. Burrowing animals may reduce hair in places where friction matters. Naked skin in mammals is rare, and when it appears, it usually comes with an obvious ecological explanation. Humans do not fit neatly into any one of those patterns. They're not aquatic. They're not naturally gigantic. They're not subterranean specialists. They are social, mobile, sweating primates that somehow traded the usual mammalian covering for a system that seems, at first glance, absurdly risky. Skin burns, skin cuts, skin dries, skin invites insects. Skin feels every shift in wind and temperature. A furless mammal should be in trouble almost immediately. And yet humans do not merely survive, they spread, they move across equatorial grasslands, high mountains, monsoon forests, frozen tundra, deserts, river valleys, coasts, and islands. They become so successful that it is easy to mistake their success for inevitability, to imagine that the human body was always meant to be this way. But the evidence remains incomplete, and what survives in the record suggests nothing so simple. Human hair loss was not a clean event, not a switch thrown on a single afternoon in prehistory. It was almost certainly gradual, uneven, entangled with other changes already underway. It belongs to the same broad transformation that reshapes posture, gait, skin, sweat, movement, daily rhythm, vulnerability, and eventually even social life. To ask why humans lost their fur is really to ask how a primate body was rebuilt for a new world, and what price had to be paid for the privilege. It helps, at the beginning, to appreciate just how odd the human body looks in the eyes of nature. Strip away language, cities, religion, memory, and machines, and a human being standing on open ground is still one of the strangest large mammals alive. The head is large and rounded, the face is flatter than expected, the shoulders are loose and expressive, the hands are delicate but dangerous, the legs are long, the feet are built not for grasping branches but for carrying weight over distance. And over most of that body, the fur that ought to soften the outline is reduced to a fine layer that barely counts as a coat at all. It is easy to forget this because humans spend so much of life clothed. Clothing hides the fact that beneath fabric is an animal that departed sharply from the family design. If every person on Earth suddenly stood as mammals stand, with no woven cover and no constructed environment, the human shape would reveal itself as something improbable, a skin-dominant primate, vulnerable and efficient at the same time. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the great temptation is to search for one dramatic answer, a single invention of nature. One moment when fur became unnecessary and vanished because the environment demanded it. But scholars still debate the timing, the pace, and the main driver. Heat is part of the story. Parasites may be part of it. Sexual selection may be part of it. Changes in social life, movement, hunting, childcare, and skin pigmentation all come into view sooner or later. No single explanation fully accounts for this body on its own. The mystery survives precisely because the human body is not built by one pressure at a time. Evolution works like weather on stone. Many forces strike together. Some are obvious. Others leave only faint marks. When the final shape appears, it can look deliberate even though it emerged from countless small adjustments over immense spans of time. There is another reason the question remains unsettled. Fur does not fossilize in the usual way. Bones remain, teeth remain, sometimes footprints remain. The shape of a pelvis or a skull can outlast an entire vanished species, but hair, skin, sweat glands, and colour vanish almost completely. The features that matter most to this story are among the least likely to survive. Scientists are forced to work indirectly. They compare living primates. They study human skin and hair follicles. They trace genes involved in pigmentation and keratin. They examine parasites that evolved with human bodies. They infer from climate, from anatomy, from movement, from what kinds of habitats early humans occupied, and what physiological burdens those habitats imposed. It is careful work, but it is still reconstruction, and reconstruction always carries uncertainty. The body tells the truth reluctantly when so much of it has disappeared. And still, the clues are strong enough to tell a real story. Humans are not actually devoid of hair follicles. In fact, The number of follicles on human skin is not dramatically lower than in chimpanzees. The surprising difference is not always the count, but the kind of hair those follicles produce. Much of the human body is covered in tiny, faint, almost invisible hairs known as vellus hair, while other mammals produce thicker terminal hair that forms a visible coat. That detail matters because it suggests the story is not simply one of hair vanishing altogether. It is, at least in part, a story of transformation. The body remains capable of producing hair, but chooses, in many regions, to produce less substantial hair. Something has changed in the regulation function and value of the coat. The mammalian inheritance is still there, but altered, quieted, reworked. That makes the human body feel less like a loss and more like a trade. Evolution rarely discards a major structure for no reason. It gives something up because something else becomes more valuable. A thick coat protects. A lightly covered, highly sweat-capable body cools. A shaded skin conceals. An exposed skin can signal health, injury, age, fertility, emotion, and alliance in ways that fur makes harder to read. A furry infant can cling. A less furry social primate may compensate with hands, carrying, and bonding behaviors of a different kind. None of these traits are simple, and not all of them appear at once, but they suggest that human hair loss belongs not to a single act of subtraction, but to an exchange that altered how the body met the environment and how individuals met one another. Imagine, then, the long middle world in which this change is underway, not a modern human stepping cleanly into existence, but generations of ancestral bodies not quite like apes and not yet like us. They move through mosaics of woodland and open country. They rest in shade when they can. They walk farther than their forest ancestors would have preferred. They carry infants. They scavenge. They watch predators. They cross exposed ground where the sun punishes every delay. Over deep time, subtle advantages begin to matter. A body that sheds heat better may travel farther in daylight. A body less burdened by certain parasites may sleep better, heal faster, reproduce more reliably. A face more legible through exposed skin may strengthen a social bond or reveal strain before words exist to explain it. These are not cinematic transformations. They're almost too small to notice in a single lifetime. But evolution is built from such almost invisible changes. Given enough time, the nearly invisible becomes the most obvious thing in the world. The irony is that modern humans often experience their lack of fur not as an adaptation, but as a problem requiring endless correction. They build houses, they sew clothes, they use blankets, sunscreen, medicine, heating, cooling, razors, mirrors, and cosmetics. They decorate hair where it remains and remove it where it persists. They praise skin, hide skin, darken skin, lighten skin, scar it, wash it, perfume it, protect it, and expose it. The human relationship to body hair is so culturally charged that it becomes hard to see the original biological puzzle beneath it. Yet that puzzle never went away. Every shiver, every sunburn, every bead of sweat rolling down the back on a hot afternoon is part of the same ancient inheritance. The near-naked body is not an accident of fashion or civilization. It is one of the oldest and most consequential facts about being human. And perhaps that is why the question continues to fascinate. It does not belong only to prehistory. It touches something immediate and intimate. To ask why humans lost their fur is to ask why the skin is so exposed to the world, why heat and cold feel the way they do, why touch matters so much, why sunlight can nourish and damage, why lice and mosquitoes have followed human beings so persistently, why the scalp kept its hair while the shoulders did not, why the face became a place of expression rather than concealment, and why culture had to rush in to protect what biology had left open. Beneath all those questions lies the deeper one. What kind of environment? What kind of life? And what kind of evolutionary gamble could possibly make a less furry mammal a better mammal? The answer does not begin with certainty. It begins with pressure, with climate, with anatomy inherited from older apes, and with a world in which hair was still the rule and bare skin still the exception. To understand why the human coat thinned, it is necessary first to understand what fur normally does, why it is so valuable, and why giving up even part of it should have been dangerous. Only then does the human body begin to make sense, not as a creature that escaped the rules of mammalian life, but as one that paid heavily to bend them. To understand how strange the human body really is, it helps to begin with a colder dawn than the one most people imagine. Before the sun rises high enough to punish exposed skin, the ground can be unexpectedly cool. Heat drains out of open land during the night. Wind arrives early. Shade lingers in hollows and among rocks. A mammal lying still in that half-light loses warmth with surprising speed, and for most mammals the answer is already in place before they are born. Fur is not simply winter clothing provided by nature. It is a continuous interface between the body and the world, a living insulation layer that manages cold, moderates heat, buffers moisture, cushions minor injury, and turns the skin from a vulnerable boundary into a better defended frontier. For a mammal, fur is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. That is why the problem begins with disbelief. Hair is one of the defining inventions of mammalian life. It appears in some form across the group, from bats to bears, from mice to wolves, from the hidden velvet of smaller creatures to the dense pelts of Arctic specialists. Even where it seems reduced, it usually remains useful in some way. Whiskers detect movement and surfaces. Guard hairs repel water. Underfur traps warm air. Seasonal coats thicken or thin according to changing light and temperature. Patterns break up outlines. Colours communicate age, sex, health, and threat. A coat can keep out rain, soften abrasion, and create a shallow cushion between flesh and the hostile world. In dry lands, it may help shade the skin from direct radiation. In cold lands, it becomes indispensable. Remove it, and an animal loses much more than a visual covering. It loses a whole system of environmental control. This becomes obvious the moment one looks beyond the simple idea that fur only keeps animals warm. In reality, fur does not behave like a blanket thrown loosely over the body. It works by trapping layers of air close to the skin and controlling how quickly heat moves in either direction. That means fur can help not only against cold, but also against excessive heat under some conditions. Desert mammals are not foolishly wearing winter coats into the furnace. Their hair can shield the skin from direct sunlight and reduce radiant heat gain, particularly when activity is timed carefully and behavior does the rest. A coat becomes part of a broader strategy. Move at the right hour, rest in shade, face the wind, dig, hide, pant, conserve. Fur is rarely acting alone, but it remains one of the most flexible tools mammals possess. It also protects against dangers that are easy to underestimate when thinking from inside modern human life. Skin is fragile, it tears on thorns, blisters under friction, cracks when dry, burns in sun, and becomes a feast for biting insects. A hairy animal moving through scrub is not invulnerable, but it carries a first line of defense over almost every part of the body. Fur slows down the reach of claws and branches. It reduces the direct impact of dust and glare. It can make it harder for some insects to reach blood quickly. It helps water bead and run. Even scent is affected because hair holds oils and odours and changes how a body advertises itself to predators, parasites, and members of its own species. A coat is not just warmth. It is mediation. It stands between the animal and immediate contact with the outside. Among primates, that mediation matters in especially intimate ways. Most primates live in close contact with bark, leaves, branches, insects, mud, rain, and one another. They groom constantly, and grooming itself depends on the presence of a coat. Fur becomes part of social life. It is searched, cleaned, combed through with fingers and teeth. Parasites are removed, dirt is found, wounds are noticed. Hierarchies are eased and reinforced through touch. To be a furry primate is not merely to be covered, it is to inhabit a shared tactile world in which the coat plays both biological and social roles. When humans later come to rely so heavily on touch, skin, expression, and prolonged care, they are not leaving behind a touch-based ancestry, they are transforming it. But before that transformation, fur is already central to how primate bodies work and how primate groups hold together. This is why any reduction in body hair should be treated as costly from the start. A less furry mammal is a more exposed mammal. Nights become harder, shade matters more, wounds matter more, insects matter more. Even daily rest becomes different because a body lying on bare ground or rough bark with less protective covering pays a higher price in discomfort and injury. For hair reduction to spread through a population, something substantial must compensate for those losses. The compensation does not have to arrive all at once. Evolution does not wait politely for a perfect package. But over time, the trade must make sense. A thinner coat must allow some other advantage powerful enough to outweigh the protection being surrendered. The point becomes clearer when comparing the few mammals that do appear relatively hairless. Elephants are often cited because they look bare from a distance, but elephants are an instructive exception precisely because they are so unlike humans. Their giant size changes the physics of heat storage and release. Large animals generate and retain heat differently from smaller ones, and they possess other mechanisms to help cope, including ear structure, mud use, bathing, and sheer thermal inertia. Rhinoceroses and hippos, though not truly naked in a simple sense, live under their own set of bodily rules as heavy animals with particular ecologies. Marine mammals reduce external hair because water changes everything about drag, insulation, and movement. And then they compensate with blubber. Naked mole rats live underground in stable tunnel climates where the usual outer defences are less necessary. In other words, when mammals reduce hair, they almost always do so in concert with very obvious alternative solutions. Humans have no blubber layer designed like a seal's, no giant elephant mass, no sheltered tunnel world, no aquatic streamlining. The human solution, whatever it is, must be found elsewhere. That alone suggests that hair loss in our lineage is bound up with a larger redesign of the body. It is not one odd feature floating by itself. It sits among changes in sweating, movement, skin chemistry, pigmentation, body proportions, daily activity, and eventually culture. A chimpanzee can retreat into forest shade with a body plan built for climbing, resting, and a different rhythm of life. A human ancestor moving over longer distances in patchier habitats may face a different set of calculations. But the coat inherited from older primates would still have been valuable. Losing part of it would have required real gains. There is a tendency in modern imagination to think of fur as primitive and nakedness as advanced, as though the hairless skin of humans were somehow a sign of refinement, a shedding of animal origins. Evolution offers no support for that kind of vanity. Fur is sophisticated. It is ancient precisely because it works. Every mammal line that keeps it is not failing to modernize. It is preserving a highly effective solution to recurring problems. From that perspective, the human condition looks less like improvement and more like risk. What kind of mammal abandons a useful standard design, only one under unusual pressure, or one that acquires an unusual compensating ability, or both? The costs would have been especially sharp for infants and juveniles. Young mammals depend heavily on the thermal and protective properties of their coats. They lose heat faster, dehydrate more easily, and suffer more quickly from exposure. A reduction in body hair among ancestral humans therefore cannot be understood only at the level of adults striding dramatically across hot plains. It would also have affected nursing, carrying, resting, and protection within the group. A species can only afford to alter something so fundamental if its entire life history shifts enough to support the change. More carrying, more shade-seeking, more cooperative care, more control over activity patterns. Perhaps eventually more use of simple coverings or shelters long before tailored clothing enters the picture. The evidence remains incomplete, but the principle is clear. The vulnerable young would have constrained what evolution could safely do. There is also the issue of water. Fur and water have a complicated relationship. A coat can hold rain, but it can also channel and shed it, especially when structured with different hair types and oils. Bare skin dries differently. It is more directly exposed to sun and wind. It can cool efficiently when wet, but it also risks rapid moisture loss under harsh conditions. This matters because any lineage moving toward reduced fur must solve not only heat stress, but also hydration stress. A body that cools well by sweating may gain a powerful advantage in one sense while creating new dependence in another. The body becomes more effective at dumping heat, but potentially more expensive to run in dry conditions because water must be available and managed. That is not a trivial exchange. It ties physiology to landscape, movement, and timing in ways furred relatives may experience differently. The remarkable thing is that fur does not merely vanish from the human story once reduction begins. Hair remains important, but its geography changes. The scalp keeps it. The face uses it selectively. The underarms and groin retain thick growth after puberty. Eyebrows and eyelashes persist because they serve specialized roles. This pattern alone hints that the body is not carelessly discarding hair wherever it can. It is reshaping it. The old mammalian covering is being edited, region by region, according to function. Some hair remains where it protects openings, diverts sweat, signals maturity, or helps manage friction. Elsewhere it becomes fine and nearly invisible. That patchwork pattern suggests a long negotiation rather than a simple loss. The body is deciding over immense spans of time, where hair still pays for itself and where another solution is better. And that brings the mystery back into focus. If fur is so valuable, if it protects against cold, heat, abrasion, insects, and exposure, if it supports social grooming and shields the young, then any serious thinning of the ancestral human coat must have occurred under unusually strong and persistent pressure. Something about the world our ancestors entered, or the way they began to live within it, made the old primate arrangement less ideal than it had once been. The gain must have been large enough to matter day after day, generation after generation, not just a small improvement, but a deep shift in the balance of costs. That shift does not begin in a vacuum. It begins in Africa, in environments that are changing, fragmenting, opening, drying, greening, then drying again, in landscapes where woodland and grassland meet and retreat, where survival no longer belongs only to creatures of the trees. What survives in the record suggests that before humans became the nearly hairless primates of later prehistory, they first had to pass through a world that was making new demands on bodies, on movement, and on time spent under the sky. Only there does it become possible to see why a good mammalian coat might slowly begin to feel like too much of a burden. Long before the human body becomes familiar, before the skin stands so openly in the sun, and before sweat begins to define the species, there is first an ape, not a modern ape, not a creature anyone could point to in a zoo and call an ancestor, but something that still belongs unmistakably to that older primate world. It carries a coat because apes carry coats. It lives within habitats where shade is still a daily guarantee rather than a temporary relief. Its body expects climbing as much as walking, gripping as much as striding, and much of its time is still governed by the logic of cover. Trees matter, woodland matters, moisture matters. A dense or at least visibly substantial fur covering is not remarkable in such a creature. It is simply the inherited condition, one written deep into primate history long before any human story begins. That starting point matters because it helps strip away one of the quiet illusions that often surround human origins. It is tempting to imagine early ancestors already halfway transformed, already waiting on open ground for the final adjustments that will make them human. But the evidence suggests a slower, stranger path. The first hominins do not appear as cleanly redesigned beings built for exposed landscapes. They emerge with bodies still carrying older compromises. Their shoulders remember climbing. Their hands remember branches. Their feet and hips are changing, but not all at once. Their skulls do not yet announce the future. Their environments, too, are mixed rather than simple. Woodland patches, gallery forests, scrub, open areas, shifting food sources, scattered danger. The world they inhabit is not a stage built neatly for a single adaptation. It is a mosaic, and the ancestral body has to live in all of it. In that mosaic, fur still makes sense. A hairy primate moving through brush, nesting or resting in sheltered places, encountering insects, rough bark, cool dawns, and sudden rain would have little reason to abandon its coat. Even partial upright walking in such a setting does not automatically demand major hair reduction. That is worth holding on to, because it cautions against narratives that make every human feature appear the moment bipedalism begins. Walking upright changes many things, but it does not instantly peel the body open. For long stretches of time, ancestral hominins are likely both familiar and strange upright enough to matter, ape-like enough to remind any observer that the old body plan has not yet been fully rewritten. What would that coat have looked like? No fossil preserves the answer directly, and scholars still debate the details, but comparative evidence gives a reasonable outline. The ancestors of humans almost certainly possessed a body covering more substantial than that of modern humans and more like that of other apes, though not necessarily identical in texture, density, or distribution. Hair might have varied by sex, age, and habitat. It may already have been changing subtly in some regions before any dramatic overall thinning took place, but the basic point remains firm. The starting condition is not nakedness waiting to be improved. It is fur as inheritance, fur as default, fur as part of an ape's ordinary relationship to its environment. And that environment deserves careful attention, because the earliest hominins are not creatures of one simple landscape. East and Central Africa across the relevant spans of time are dynamic, unstable places. Forests expand and contract. Wet periods give way to drier intervals. Lake levels rise and fall. Tectonic activity alters local geography. River systems shift. Habitats become patchier in some regions and more connected in others. A creature able to survive only in dense forest would struggle when those forests pull back. A creature able to move between trees and more open ground gains an advantage. This does not mean the ancient world suddenly turns into a boundless grassland occupied by heroic runners. It means the ecological map becomes harder to read. Food is less predictably enclosed by cover. Safety is less guaranteed by vertical escape alone. Distance begins to matter differently. In such conditions, the ancestral ape body starts to feel pressure without yet surrendering its past. It walks more. It may stand more often to scan. It carries more often. It spends more time moving between patches rather than remaining within one continuous refuge. Each of these changes remains modest at first, but their cumulative effect is profound. A body built for both climbing and ground movement is already living in tension. A coat inherited from more shaded arboreal life still provides protection, but it may also begin to create costs once activity patterns change and exposed movement becomes more common. Not yet enough, perhaps, to drive a major transformation, but enough to begin the long arithmetic that evolution never stops performing. The details of early hominin life remain frustratingly incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the route from ape to human. What survives in the record suggests diversity rather than a single march forward. Some early hominins may have spent more time in wooded habitats, others may have exploited more open country, some may have retained more arboreal behavior than later species. Different populations likely face different ecological pressures at different times. That matters because hair loss, when it begins in earnest, may not arise from one universal setting. It may emerge gradually as multiple trends align, increasing terrestriality, longer daily movement, greater heat load, changing social organization, altered parasite exposure, and eventually a body increasingly committed to cooling itself through skin rather than coat. At this earlier stage, though, the coat still belongs. Imagine one of these ancestral populations in a landscape of broken woodland, where figs ripen seasonally, where tubers or other fallback foods matter more in lean times, where predators wait in grass or near water, where insects gather in damp pockets, where nights can be chilly after hot afternoons. In that world, fur is not a relic, it is support. It preserves warmth during sleep, softens passage through scrub, and keeps the skin from direct punishment. Grooming likely remains a central part of daily social life, as it does among living apes. Grooming removes parasites, yes, but it also does more than that. It creates peace. It settles tensions. It reinforces belonging. In a furry primate society, the coat is both body and social surface. This is one reason the eventual human shift is so interesting. Humans do not become less tactile when body hair declines. They become, in many ways, even more dependent on touch, care, closeness, visible emotion, and prolonged cooperation. But that later world begins here, inside an older primate condition where touch is filtered through fur. A mother handles an infant through a coat. A companion grooms another's back through a coat. Parasites are detected in a coat. Injury is hidden or revealed within a coat. If that surface later changes, then the social meanings of the body may change with it. Yet in the beginning, before skin becomes the great public frontier of the human animal, fur still organizes much of what contact means. There is also the matter of appearance. Modern humans are so accustomed to hair variation being culturally charged that it is easy to project similar meanings too strongly into deep prehistory. Some signaling surely mattered among early primates and hominins, as it does in many mammals. Condition, maturity, dominance, reproductive state, and health can all leave traces in hair and skin. But at this stage, the key point is more basic. A furry body conceals fine details. It smooths contours, masks smaller injuries, blurs muscle definition, and makes subtle shifts in blood flow less visible. The face remains important, of course, but a heavily coated body gives fewer immediate visual cues than one with more exposed skin. Later in human evolution, this may become unexpectedly important. For now, it is enough to note that the ape inheritance is not only practical, it shapes what can be seen. So the ancestral picture is not one of loss, but of possession. Early hominins begin with an ape's biological wealth, a coat, a primate's skin system not yet radically exposed, habits of grooming, reliance on mixed habitats, and a body only partly committed to the ground. The transformation to come is therefore more dramatic than it first appears. Humans do not merely trim excess hair from an already modern design. They emerge from a lineage that once looked, thermally and socially, far more typical of mammals and of apes in particular. This is also where the limits of the fossil record become especially frustrating. Bones can show a pelvis broadening in ways consistent with upright walking. A foot can show commitment to terrestrial movement. Teeth can hint at diet. Isotopes may suggest habitat use. But none of these things can directly show whether the shoulders were shaded by thick hair or whether the chest was already thinning. Scientists are forced to infer body covering from the broader pattern. That means caution is necessary. It is possible that hair reduction began piecemeal before any dramatic human-like nakedness emerged. It is possible that different body regions changed at different rates. It is possible that selection acted first on sweating capacity, with fur reduction following unevenly. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of the story. Still, certain truths hold. The ancestors of humans begin as hairy apes in fluctuating African environments. Their coat is useful. Their world is becoming more variable. Their bodies are entering a new relationship with distance, exposure, and ground-based life. The old primate inheritance is not yet gone, but the balance is shifting. A body that once solved most of its problems under trees must now solve more of them under the open sky. That does not immediately explain why humans lost their fur, but it reveals where the first tension arises. The coat belongs to the past, while the landscape increasingly demands another future. That future takes shape not in a single habitat but in a continent repeatedly reworked by climate. Rainfall patterns drift. Grasslands advance, then retreat, woodlands fragment. Resources that once lay close together pull farther apart. Under those conditions, an ape body does not remain merely an ape body. It is tested, stretched, and slowly edited. The next part of the mystery lies there, in the changing African world itself, where heat, distance, and exposure begin pressing hard enough to make even a good mammalian coat feel like part of the problem. The landscape does not change all at once. It never does. Forest does not simply vanish in a dramatic sweep and reveal a ready-made human world beneath it. Instead, the African environments inhabited by early hominins shift in pulses, in fragments, in uneven rhythms that unfold across immense spans of time. Wet periods spread green corridors through regions that later become harsher. Lakes expand, then shrink. Woodlands loosen at their edges. Open patches widen. Seasonal stress grows sharper in some places and relaxes in others. Over thousands and then millions of years, populations living within these unstable mosaics are forced into a more demanding bargain with terrain and climate. They cannot rely on one habitat staying generous forever. They cannot assume shade will always be near, or that food will always be clustered within easy reach. Movement becomes more necessary, and the body begins to experience the land differently. This is one of the deep turning points in the story, because fur makes sense within a world of cover and shorter exposed movement. It is still useful almost everywhere, but its costs become more noticeable when daylight travel lengthens and time under direct sun increases in a heavily wooded environment. The coat does not often have to negotiate the full burden of relentless solar exposure combined with sustained walking. In patchier country, that burden accumulates. A body crossing open stretches between scattered resources carries its own heat longer. A coat that once protected may begin, under certain conditions, to trap too much warmth. Not always, not in every hour or season, but often enough for selection to take notice. Africa, during the critical phases of hominin evolution, is not merely hot in the simple sense modern shorthand suggests. It is variable, and that variability matters. Some areas become more seasonal, some swing more sharply between wet abundance and dry scarcity. Some create ecological mosaics in which the safe, shaded, food-rich spaces are farther apart than they used to be. Such conditions do not just reshape where animals live, they reshape timing, energy budgets, and daily risk. An animal may need to travel farther for water, carrion, plant foods, or social contact. It may need to leave shelter at times when heat is already climbing. It may need to remain active longer in terrain that reflects sunlight upward from stone, dust, and pale grass. What survives in the record suggests repeated ecological instability rather than one smooth trend, and that instability may be exactly what matters. Bodies evolve not only for average conditions, but for the hard margins where failure becomes costly. For early hominins, the challenge is not only temperature itself, but heat produced from within. A body in motion is a furnace. Muscles generate heat continuously, and unless that heat is shed, performance drops, judgment falters, and eventually the body fails altogether. For a primate lineage beginning to spend more time on the ground and more time moving between scattered resources, the old thermal balance may no longer be ideal. Upright walking already changes how the body meets the sun. A biped presents less surface area directly to overhead radiation than a quadruped does, at least during the fiercest part of the day. That may offer a modest advantage, but modest advantages invite further pressure. If the body can reduce heat gain from posture, then shedding internally generated heat becomes the next crucial problem. Here the climate story and the body story begin to tighten around each other. A more open world does not automatically produce a less hairy primate. Many mammals live in open country with coats intact because they solve thermal problems in other ways. They pant, rest, burrow, limit daytime activity, or simply remain built for shorter bursts of effort. The human lineage appears to drift toward a different solution, one that depends increasingly on staying active under conditions that punish overheating. That would have made the old coat progressively more expensive, especially if daily travel, foraging range, and social movement all began to expand. The evidence remains incomplete, but the logic is compelling. If ancestral humans are becoming creatures of a longer terrestrial activity in seasonally challenging landscapes, then heat dissipation ceases to be a minor issue and becomes central. This does not mean hair reduction begins as a clean adaptation to grassland alone. Scholars still debate how open those habitats truly were at different times and for different species. Some early hominins almost certainly continued to rely heavily on wooded settings. Others may have ranged more broadly across mixed terrain. The point is not that trees disappear and naked skin appears. The point is that recurring exposure increases. The amount of time a body spends under direct sun, crossing warm ground, carrying loads, scanning for predators, and exploiting dispersed resources begins to rise. Under those circumstances, even a good coat may become less good than it used to be. There is a revealing irony in this. Fur protects skin from solar radiation, but it can also interfere with rapid evaporative cooling if the animal depends on sweating across much of the body. A coat becomes a thermal compromise. It helps in one dimension and hinders in another. As long as the balance favors insulation and shielding, fur remains the winning design. But if the balance shifts toward the urgent need to unload internal heat during prolonged activity, then the same covering starts to look like resistance. Evolution does not ask whether fur is useful in the abstract. It asks whether, in the actual conditions faced by reproducing individuals, it helps more than it harms. Climate instability may also have affected social life in ways that matter for this story. More variable environments tend to reward flexibility, cooperation, memory of scattered resources, and perhaps wider ranging between groups and places. Carrying food, sharing, defending vulnerable young, and returning to key water points may all become more important. None of these behaviors require hair loss by themselves, but together they increase the amount of time bodies spend solving problems in exposed terrain. A primate that can cool efficiently while moving, carrying, and waiting in the heat gains a quiet but persistent edge. Such an edge does not need to be dramatic to alter evolution. It only needs to improve survival and reproduction often enough across generations. The changing African world also brings another problem closer to the surface. Nights and mornings do not cease to matter, just because midday heat grows harsher. A less furry body gains one advantage and risks another. That tension may explain why any major reduction in body hair is likely gradual and partial before it becomes more complete. If the coat shrinks too quickly, cold stress during rest, vulnerability to insects, and risks to infants become severe. If it remains too thick, heat stress during activity becomes worse. Evolution is therefore forced into a long negotiation, not a leap. Different body regions may change at different times. Behavioral compensation may become more important. Shade use, altered daily scheduling, water dependence, and social care could all help buffer the transition. The body alone does not solve the problem. The body and behavior solve it together. This interplay between climate and behavior is one of the most human aspects of the story. Even before fire, clothing, and constructed shelter fully reshape the species, ancestral humans are unlikely to have been passive recipients of environmental pressure. They choose routes. They rest when they can. They exploit wind, shade, and timing. They may increasingly coordinate activity rather than living as isolated bodies reacting alone. Such flexibility makes more radical anatomical change possible. A lineage that can behaviorally reduce some of the costs of hair loss becomes freer to exploit its benefits. The environment supplies the pressure, but behavior expands what evolution can afford to attempt. There is another clue hidden in the very geography of human origins. Tropical and subtropical African environments do not only challenge a body with air temperature, they challenge it with radiant load. Direct sun matters, ground heat matters, reflected light matters. A dark, exposed skin adapted to such conditions can perform remarkably well if supported by effective sweating and circulation. But that combination requires the body to reorganize itself. A coat that once stood between the skin and the world is no longer the primary interface. The skin itself begins to take on more of the burden. It must defend against ultraviolet damage, manage water loss, host sweat glands, and survive repeated exposure. In that sense, climate does not merely push fur away, it pulls skin into a new evolutionary importance. This is why the story of fur loss cannot be separated from the story of skin. The moment ancestral humans begin spending more of their lives in conditions where exposed skin matters, pigmentation, sweating, and hair reduction become linked. They are no longer independent traits. They form part of a system. The old primate body, furry and less exposed, solves environmental problems one way. The emerging human body solves them another. The turning point lies in the landscape because the landscape changes what the body most urgently needs to do. Yet caution is necessary. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation, and climate alone is not enough. Plenty of animals face heat without becoming human-like. What climate does is create the stage on which other changes become more plausible. It makes cooling more valuable. It makes prolonged movement more consequential. It increases the benefit of any trait that allows activity under the sun. In that setting, the reduction of body hair stops looking absurd and starts looking possible. By the time this process is well underway, the body's no longer simply inheriting ape solutions. It is improvising new ones. The coat begins to thin, or at least becomes less central. The skin gains importance. Upright posture matters more. Daily life stretches across hotter, more exposed intervals, and within that altered body, one physiological system becomes increasingly decisive: sweating. Once that system begins to dominate cooling, thick fur is no longer just old inheritance. It becomes a burden the lineage may no longer be willing to carry. At some point in this long transformation, the human body begins to trust water on the skin more than air in the coat. That is the real pivot. Mammals can cool themselves in many ways, but humans rely on one method so heavily that it shapes nearly every hour of life in hot conditions. They sweat in extraordinary volume, and they do so across most of the body surface. This is so familiar that it barely seems remarkable, yet among large mammals it is one of the defining oddities of the species. A running dog pants. Many animals seek shade, spread saliva, alter blood flow, or simply stop moving when the heat climbs. Humans do some of those things too, but what sets them apart is their capacity to pour water through the skin and let evaporation carry internal heat away. Once that system becomes central, thick body fur starts to look less like protection and more like interference. Sweating itself is not uniquely human. Other mammals sweat to varying degrees, and primates are not strangers to the mechanism, but humans appear to possess an especially dense and active network of eccrine sweat glands over much of the body. These glands release a watery secretion directly onto the skin surface, and when that water evaporates, it takes heat with it. The principle is simple. The consequences are enormous. Evaporation can remove heat far more effectively during sustained activity than insulation or panting alone under certain conditions, especially when the body is upright, exposed, and still in motion. A primate that can sweat heavily without overheating can remain active in the sun longer than many competitors or predators that must pause, pant, or retreat. That advantage only works if the sweat can do its job. A heavy coat complicates the process. Hair traps air, slows evaporation from the skin surface, and changes how moisture moves across the body. In some conditions that is useful. In the system emerging in humans, it becomes costly. If heat dissipation through evaporation is the new priority, then reducing the visible coat becomes increasingly sensible. The body does not need to become completely hairless. It only needs to reduce the kind of thick terminal hair that turns the skin into a poorly ventilated surface. Fine body hair can remain. Follicles can remain. What changes is the relationship between skin, air, and heat. Sweat now needs direct access to the environment, and the body begins to cooperate by lowering the barrier. This may be why the human condition is so deceptive. People often think of hair loss as the main innovation, and sweating as a consequence. It may be closer to the reverse. Scholars still debate the sequence, but it is entirely plausible that enhanced sweating becomes increasingly important first, and that broad coat reduction follows because a heavily furred body no longer suits the cooling system. Selection is favouring. In that sense, humans do not simply lose fur and then discover sweating. They become a sweating species, and in becoming one, they can no longer afford the old coat in the old form. There is profound ecological implication here. Efficient sweating is not only about surviving heat, it is about preserving performance in heat. A body that can continue walking, carrying, scanning, digging, or later hunting during the hottest parts of the day gains access to time that other animals may surrender. This does not make early humans invincible under the sun. Sweating is expensive. It drains water and salts. It can fail in still, humid air. It requires circulation that moves heat from the working muscles to the skin, and if dehydration sets in, the system becomes dangerous. But in dry or moderately arid environments with access to water, sweating grants something rare, the ability to remain operational while the landscape grows punishing. That matters because evolution rewards not theoretical comfort but usable time. A lineage able to exploit hotter hours can travel farther between patches of food. It can process carcasses with less competition from carnivores that overheat more easily while running. It can search wider territories. It can carry dependent young or valuable resources over longer distances. It can endure delays, detours, and scarcity with a margin that furrier relatives may not possess. None of this requires dramatic scenes of non-stop running across savanna horizons. It only requires repeated daily episodes in which better cooling allows slightly more movement, slightly more foraging, slightly more survival. Over long stretches of evolutionary time, slight margins are enough. The anatomy of the emerging human body begins to make more sense once seen through this lens. Long legs are not only about stride length. Upright posture is not only about freeing the hands. Narrower body regions in some populations, high surface area for heat exchange, blood flow near the skin, and the massive physiological investment in sweat glands all align around a creature whose thermal strategy is increasingly unusual. The old primate model depends more on cover, shorter bursts, and different rhythms of activity. The human model leans toward endurance not only in running, though that becomes important later, but in movement generally. Endurance in being out there, under the sky, for longer than a typical ape would choose or tolerate. What survives in the evidence supports this broad picture, though not every detail is settled. Humans possess far more active eccrine sweating than chimpanzees, and their body hair is far less effective as a coat. The exact timing of when these traits intensified remains debated because skin and glands do not fossilize cleanly. Scientists infer their emergence from comparative anatomy, genetics, and the logic of thermoregulation in changing habitats. The evidence remains incomplete, but no single explanation for human fur reduction can ignore sweating. Once the body becomes committed to evaporative cooling, reduced fur is no longer a strange side effect. It becomes part of the machinery. There is also a subtle but important distinction between feeling hot and becoming dangerously overheated. Many animals can endure heat if they remain still. Far fewer can generate large internal heat loads through sustained muscular work and continue functioning safely. That is the problem a sweating body solves. Muscles generate heat relentlessly during locomotion. Brains and organs operate within narrow thermal limits. Even small rises in core temperature can impair coordination and endurance. A cooling system that allows internal heat to be unloaded continuously while movement goes on is therefore not just useful, it may be decisive. The human body, in effect, shifts toward a strategy of exposing its thermal exchange surface directly to the world and then flooding that surface with evaporating fluid when necessary. This strategy, however, comes with costs that shape the rest of human evolution. A sweating is less hairy body becomes thirsty. It must find water more reliably. It must protect exposed skin from sun damage. It must handle mineral loss, dehydration risk, and cold vulnerability during rest or at night. A coat is a passive solution. Sweating is active, conditional, and expensive. It works brilliantly when the body is hydrated and the environment allows evaporation. It works less well in extreme humidity. It can be squandered. It can fail. So the rise of sweating is not a free gift. It is a bargain that ties the human body more tightly to behavior, planning, and eventually culture. Water sources matter more. Shade remains important. Timing remains important. Later on, clothing and shelter will help cover the new vulnerabilities, but the physiological commitment comes first. There is even a social dimension hidden inside this system. A sweaty body signals exertion, stress, fear, illness, and heat load in highly visible ways. It produces scent changes, it glistens, it flushes, it becomes more readable. Among social primates, bodily readability can matter. Exposed skin and visible moisture make internal state harder to conceal than it would be beneath a dense coat. Scholars still debate how much weight to place on this, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. But once the human body becomes more skin-centered, expression expands beyond the face alone. The entire body becomes a site where effort, health, and condition can be seen. Another striking detail is that the human body does not simply abandon all hair when sweating becomes central. The scalp retains dense hair, and that may itself make thermal sense. A thick scalp covering can shield the head from direct solar radiation, while the face and body remain more open to evaporative cooling. In other words, the body may have kept hair where shading the brain case was worth the cost, even while reducing it elsewhere. That patchwork outcome is exactly what one would expect from evolution if heat management, not nakedness for its own sake, were guiding the trade. The body is not chasing bareness. It is optimizing a new cooling design region by region. It is tempting to imagine that once sweating becomes powerful enough, the mystery is solved. But the story is not quite that tidy. Plenty of questions remain. How quickly did the coat thin? Did hair reduction begin before eccrine sweating reached near modern levels? Or after, did different hominin species experiment with different balances between fur and sweat? How much did parasite pressure or sexual selection accelerate a process already underway for thermal reasons? The evidence cannot answer every detail. Yet the deeper pattern is hard to escape. A body that cools itself through skin cannot remain heavily insulated in the old primate way and still reap the full benefit of that system. The human animal then begins to emerge as a creature not only of intelligence and hands, but of exposed thermodynamics. Heat becomes something to manage actively, not merely endure. Movement in hot terrain becomes something the body is increasingly built to permit. Fur, once a treasured mammalian inheritance, starts to lose the competition with sweat. The coat thins, the skin takes over, and the day opens wider. That widening of the day may help explain another striking feature of human evolution. because once a body can shed heat while still moving, it is no longer limited to the short bursts and shaded pauses typical of many other animals. It can keep going, it can walk farther. Under some conditions, it can hunt by exhausting what it cannot outrun. The story of lost fur now begins to merge with the story of endurance. Once the body can cool itself efficiently while in motion, distance changes meaning. A landscape that once had to be crossed in cautious stages, from shade to shade, begins to open in new ways. Not because it becomes gentle, but because the body becomes harder to stop. This is one of the quiet revolutions in human evolution. The emerging human form is not the fastest animal on the plain, not even close. It cannot match the explosive acceleration of antelope, the spring of a cat, or the raw strength of many predators, but it does not need to. What it begins to acquire is something stranger and, in the right conditions, more powerful, the capacity to keep moving long after other bodies are forced to slow, pant, hide, or collapse into rest. The roots of that ability are anatomical before they are cultural. Upright posture alters how the body balances and bears weight over distance. Long legs increase stride efficiency, a spring-like Achilles tendon, arched feet, stabilized head carriage, and the rearrangement of the trunk all point toward a creature increasingly adapted not just to standing and shuffling between trees, but to sustained terrestrial travel. Some of these features become especially important in later members of the genus Homo, and scholars still debate exactly when the full package emerges. But what survives in the record suggests a gradual consolidation of a body more committed to endurance than any ape body before it. This is not simply about speed, it is about repeated steps taken economically under the sun. In such a body, reduced fur begins to make even more sense. Walking long distances generates heat, carrying stone, food, or infants generates more. Scavenging across wide ranges, following animal trails, monitoring water points, and returning to known shelters all impose a thermal burden that accumulates hour after hour. A thick coat might still protect in the morning chill, but by midday it would exact a price. A less insulated body, able to flush heat outward and bathe the skin in evaporating sweat, can continue operating in windows of time that would have become more punishing for a furrier primate. That advantage need not require running at first. Even walking endurance alone would have altered the economy of daily life. This matters because many of the activities likely important to early humans are not brief or tidy. They involve delay, search, waiting, carrying, and return. A carcass located far from shade must be approached, defended, opened, processed, and partially transported. Plant foods scattered across patchy habitats require memory and patience. Water is not always near when it's needed. Vulnerable young cannot simply be left behind. In all these cases, the body is not winning by sprinting. It is winning by refusing to quit. A species that can endure exposure while remaining effective gains access to opportunities that less heat-tolerant competitors may leave unused. This is where the famous idea of persistence hunting enters the story, though it needs careful handling. Persistence hunting in its classic form involves pursuing an animal over long distances in hot conditions until the prey overheats and can no longer escape. It has been documented among some recent hunter-gatherers under specific conditions, and it demonstrates what a sweating, endurance-adapted human body can do, but it should not be treated as the single magic answer to human hair loss. Scholars still debate how ancient, widespread, or evolutionarily central persistence hunting really was in early human history. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the whole transformation. Even so, The existence of this capacity reveals something important. A relatively slow primate, if cooled efficiently and motivated enough, can turn heat itself into a weapon. That possibility only exists because the human body and the prey body fail in different ways. Many quadrupeds cool primarily through panting, and panting becomes less effective when an animal must continue galloping. There are conflicts between breathing rhythms and running rhythms, between speed and heat control. Humans, by contrast, decouple much of this problem. They can breathe independently of stride, maintain steady forward motion, and dump heat through sweating over broad skin surfaces. They pay for this with water loss, but in dry heat the system can be remarkably effective. Under such conditions, a less furry body is not a cosmetic change. It is part of a predatory or scavenging advantage rooted in thermodynamics. Even without full persistence hunting, endurance changes the social map. A group able to travel farther in a day can maintain wider territories, revisit key places more reliably, connect scattered resources, and perhaps sustain looser but broader social networks. This can affect mating patterns, information flow, risk sharing, and the survival of children when local conditions deteriorate. The body's growing ability to remain active in heat therefore has consequences beyond food acquisition alone. It enlarges the world. It stretches what counts as reachable. It gives mobility a new seriousness, and mobility, once it becomes reliable, changes nearly everything. There is another layer to this. Endurance movement favors rhythm, and rhythm favors cooperation. A body built for longer travel is especially effective when supported by group awareness, shared goals, and anticipatory knowledge of the land. One individual may lag, another may carry, another may scout, but the group holds together over distance because the body plan allows it. Fur reduction, sweating, and endurance are therefore not isolated biological curiosities. They begin to reinforce an emerging human way of life in which coordination matters more, memory matters more, and the body's ability to remain present in difficult conditions becomes a collective asset rather than a purely individual one. What survives in the anatomy supports this sense of integration. The stabilization of the head helps maintain visual tracking while moving. The nuchal ligament, important in head control during running, becomes more pronounced in humans than in apes. The gluteal system supports balance during locomotion. Foot structure shifts from grasping to propulsion. These details may sound technical, but together they describe a body being reorganized for repeated forward travel. Such a body does not become less ape-like in one step, and different hominin species likely varied in their capacities, but the overall direction is difficult to miss. The human line moves towards sustained locomotion in open or mixed terrain, and once that happens, efficient cooling is no longer optional. It becomes central. Reduced fur follows naturally within that logic. There is a revealing contrast here with chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. Chimpanzees can walk upright for limited periods, and they can travel on the ground, but their bodies are not optimized for long-distance, heat-heavy terrestrial endurance. Their locomotion, daily range, and thermal strategies belong to another way of being an ape. Humans do not simply improve upon that design, they diverge from it. They become specialists in a peculiar niche, the moderately sized, highly social, sweaty endurance primate. That niche does not demand total hairlessness, but it strongly rewards a body less burdened by a dense insulating coat. The consequences would have been cumulative and self-reinforcing. Better cooling permits more travel. More travel increases the value of efficient carrying, planning, and social cohesion. Wider ranging may increase exposure to variable climates, predators, and novel pathogens, which in turn selects for still greater flexibility. A body that can stay active under heat becomes more dependent on water, but also more capable of reaching it. A lineage that can process carcasses or pursue weakened prey during hot intervals gains richer energy returns, which may support larger brains and more costly offspring over time. None of these developments can be reduced simply to fur loss, but fur loss fits within the package like a gear within a machine. And yet caution remains necessary. There is a risk of turning the human body into a neat engineering diagram, as though evolution designed every feature in conscious anticipation of later triumphs. Real evolution is messier. Traits arise at different times, under overlapping pressures, and sometimes for reasons only partly related to the roles they later serve. A slightly less hairy body may first benefit ordinary daytime foraging rather than heroic hunts. Enhanced sweating may initially support longer walking rather than running. The package may assemble unevenly, with some traits co-opted later into more dramatic behaviours. The evidence remains incomplete, and what survives in the record suggests gradual accumulation more often than sudden innovation. Still, by the time the human body is clearly moving in this direction, the old primate coat belongs to a different economy of effort. Under the new conditions, every dense patch of body hair becomes part of a thermal problem that the lineage is trying to solve. The body can no longer afford to be insulated like a forest ape if it intends to function like an endurance traveller. The trade is stark. Protection is reduced so that persistence becomes possible. Vulnerability increases so that range increases. Skin is exposed so that movement can continue. And once the skin is exposed, it must face another challenge every bit as ancient and unforgiving as heat itself. The sun does not simply warm, it damages. Ultraviolet radiation alters cells, degrades folate, burns tissue, and forces the skin into a new evolutionary bargain of its own. The loss of fur therefore cannot be understood only as a triumph of cooling. It also creates a crisis of exposure, one that helps explain why human skin changes so profoundly alongside body hair, and why the colour of that skin becomes inseparable from the story of how the fur was lost in the first place. A less hairy body gains a powerful advantage in cooling, but it also commits a kind of exposure that no mammal can ignore for long. Once fur thins and the skin becomes the main surface meeting the world, sunlight stops being a background condition and becomes a constant evolutionary force. In equatorial and subequatorial Africa, that force is not gentle. The sun does not merely warm exposed flesh. It strikes with ultraviolet radiation that damages DNA, burns tissue, alters immune responses, and threatens delicate chemical balances inside the body. A primate that gives up much of its coat without changing its skin would inherit a dangerous vulnerability almost immediately. This is why the story of human fur loss and the story of human skin colour are inseparable. One problem creates the other. A body open for cooling must now survive the sky. At the heart of this lies melanin, the broad family of pigments that darken skin and help absorb and scatter ultraviolet radiation. Melanin is not unique to humans, but in a less furry human lineage, it becomes newly crucial. When hair no longer shades most of the body, pigmentation must do more of the protective work. Dark skin in high UV environments is not a decorative feature, and not a late cultural marker projected backward into nature. It is part of the body's defensive architecture. It helps protect folate, a vitamin essential to cell division, fertility, fetal development, and many other processes. Folate can be degraded by ultraviolet exposure, and while the full evolutionary significance of this relationship is still debated in some details, the broader pattern is widely supported. A less hairy primate living under strong tropical sun would have needed robust protection against repeated radiation load, and dark pigmentation offers exactly that. This helps explain an important point often lost in shallow discussions of human appearance. The ancestral human condition, once body hair was substantially reduced, was almost certainly dark-skinned. What survives in genetics, physiology, and geography strongly suggests that heavily pigmented skin is the older solution for a largely exposed human body in Africa. Lighter skin emerges much later in some populations after migrations into lower UV environments, where the balance of costs and benefits changes. The bare or nearly bare human body does not begin pale and then darken. It begins with the deep protective logic of melanin, because without that, the loss of fur would have been far more dangerous. But the story is not quite as simple as protection from sunburn alone. Modern people often think of ultraviolet stress mainly in terms of burns or skin cancer, yet evolution is not especially sensitive to diseases that strike mostly after reproduction. What matters more in deep time is what sunlight does to the body during the reproductive years and to vulnerable offspring. Damage to folate balance, repeated tissue stress, immune strain, and the cumulative burden of intense solar exposure would all have mattered more directly than the skin cancers that loom large in modern medicine. A skin system able to absorb punishment while preserving fertility and development would have been of enormous value. In that sense, pigmentation is not merely about surviving the environment, it is about reproducing successfully within it. At the same time, the body faces a counter-pressure. Human beings also need ultraviolet light for the synthesis of vitamin D, which is essential for bone health, immune function, and many developmental processes. Too much protection from UV can therefore create a different problem, especially in regions where sunlight is weak or seasonal. This is one reason the global pattern of human skin pigmentation becomes so revealing. Near the equator, where UV is intense year-round, dark skin protects a less hairy body from overload. Far from the equator, where UV is weaker, especially in winter, lighter skin can permit more efficient vitamin D production. Scholars still debate the relative weights of the different mechanisms, and no single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern, but the broad evolutionary balance is clear. Once the fur is gone, skin color becomes a critical adjustable trait. That shift may have unfolded gradually, just as hair reduction itself likely did. The first stages of coat thinning would not immediately expose every body region equally. Some areas may remain better shaded than others. Some hominin populations may live in more wooded environments or spend more time under partial cover. Behavior can buffer exposure to a degree, but as the body becomes increasingly committed to sweating and open-air activity, the skin can no longer remain an afterthought. It becomes a frontline organ. It must regulate heat, defend against pathogens, maintain water balance, heal from abrasion, and withstand radiation. Melanization is part of how the skin rises to that new burden. There is also a subtle ecological logic in the combination of dark skin and reduced fur that fits the broader human pattern beautifully. Dark skin absorbs and manages radiation, while still allowing the body to shed internal heat through evaporative cooling. A thick coat would block the direct burden of sunlight, but at the cost of trapping heat generated by movement. Dark, exposed skin solves the problem differently. It accepts contact with the environment, but does so with protection built into the tissue itself. The body is no longer hiding from the sun behind a coat. It is meeting the sun directly with a modified skin system. That is a more demanding strategy, but also a more flexible one for a highly mobile, endurance-oriented primate. What makes this especially striking is how many modern assumptions it quietly overturns. People often imagine that dark skin must somehow be a secondary adaptation layered onto an already human form. In fact, it is closer to the opposite. Dark pigmentation is part of the original package that makes a more exposed human body workable in Africa. Light skin, where it later evolves, is a regional adjustment made by populations moving into radically different UV regimes. The evidence from genes associated with pigmentation strongly supports repeated changes in skin color under different environmental pressures, but the deep baseline remains. The first substantially furless humans are not pale bodies under African sun. Their dark bodies shape to endure it. This matters not only biologically, but conceptually. It reminds us that the human body is not a universal template with superficial colors painted onto it. It is a set of local solutions repeatedly remodeled by geography and climate. Hair loss creates a new problem. Pigmentation answers it. Migration changes the problem again. New pigmentation patterns emerge in response. The body remains one story, but its chapters differ according to latitude, sunlight, diet, and time. That is one reason discussions of human appearance become so distorted when stripped of evolutionary context. Features that later acquire immense cultural meaning began as practical negotiations with light, heat, and chemistry. The exposed skin also changes the body's visibility in other ways. Once hair no longer conceals so much of the surface, blood flow, flushing, injury, scarring, disease, and age may become more legible. Some of these changes would be subtle on dark skin just as they are on light skin, though visible in different ways. The point is not that bare skin makes every internal state obvious. It is that a less furry body is a more openly signalled body. Condition leaves traces. Damage leaves traces. Recovery leaves traces. This may later become important for social communication and mate choice, though the evidence remains incomplete and scholars still debate how much explanatory weight such factors deserve. Even so, the new prominence of skin almost certainly changes what conspecifics can read from one another. Then there is the matter of children. A less hairy infant in a high UV environment would be especially vulnerable without protective pigmentation and social buffering. Young bodies are small, sensitive, and dependent. They lose water faster. They burn more easily. Their development is more fragile. This reinforces a wider point running through the entire story. Human fur loss could not have succeeded as an isolated adult trait. It had to be supported by a whole life history system, including maternal behavior, carrying, shade use, and later cultural practices. Dark skin helps protect the exposed body, but care still matters. Evolution never solves one problem in only one place. It distributes the solution across physiology, behavior, and society. The more one looks at the evidence, the less human hair loss resembles a simple stripping away. It looks instead like a replacement of one protective logic with another. Fur once handled much of the relationship between body and sun. Now pigmentation, sweating, and behavior take over. The coat once controlled the interface. Now the skin itself becomes specialized enough to do the work. What disappears from the surface is compensated by what deepens beneath it. And yet the new system has limits. Even dark skin does not make the sun irrelevant. Shade remains valuable. Timing remains important. Water remains essential. A sweating, exposed body is wonderfully effective in the right conditions, but it is also expensive and vulnerable in ways a fully furred mammal is not. That vulnerability may have opened the door for other forces to matter more strongly than they once did. Parasites, biting insects, skin infections, and the constant irritation of small organisms living on the body may all have changed significance once the old coat began to thin. If so, then the exposed skin of early humans was not only a thermal and solar surface, it was also a battlefield. A dense coat does not only keep out wind and sun, it also creates habitat. Between hairs, against warm skin, in seams of sweat and oil, small organisms find shelter, moisture, and blood. Lice cling to shafts, ticks crawl upward from grass, fleas move between bedding, nest material, and resting bodies. Mites inhabit follicles. Biting flies probe whatever surface they can reach. For most mammals, this burden is ancient and constant, managed but never fully escaped. Grooming helps. Immune systems help. Behavior helps. But parasites remain part of the ordinary tax that furred bodies pay for being alive. Once the human lineage begins thinning that fur, a provocative possibility emerges. Perhaps reduced body hair was not only about losing heat more efficiently. Perhaps it also made the body a less welcoming landscape for the creatures that fed upon it. This idea has obvious appeal because it fits an exposed, mobile primate living in warm environments where parasites are relentless. A thick coat gives ectoparasites places to hide, breed, and evade removal. It may increase the time needed to detect them and the difficulty of reaching them. A less hairy body offers fewer concealed routes, fewer anchor points, and greater visibility when something is moving across the skin. A louse on bare or nearly bare skin is easier to notice than a louse deep in a dense pelt. A tick may have fewer protected zones in which to settle. Even biting insects that do not live permanently on the body may find it harder to approach unnoticed if skin is more exposed and social companions can inspect one another more effectively. In that sense, fur reduction could have reduced parasite load directly or made parasite control more efficient. There is a reason scientists keep returning to this possibility, even if the evidence remains incomplete. Parasites are not trivial irritants. They drain blood, spread disease, inflame skin, disrupt sleep, weaken children, and compromise already stressed bodies. In tropical and subtropical settings, those costs can be severe. A slight reduction in parasite burden might therefore yield real fitness benefits, especially in a lineage with slow reproduction, dependent offspring, and growing reliance on sustained activity. If the body is already under pressure from heat, dehydration, injury, and exposure, then fewer parasites could matter a great deal. Evolution often favors small savings when these savings recur every day. Still, scholars still debate how far this explanation can take the story. No single explanation fully accounts for human fur loss, and the parasite hypothesis is a good example of why caution is necessary. Plenty of mammals live with heavy parasite pressure without losing their coats. Many manage with grooming, immune defenses, dust bathing, wallowing, mutual cleaning, or habitat choice. Parasites are powerful selective forces, but they do not automatically strip a lineage of fur. So if parasites helped shape human hair reduction, they likely did so in combination with other pressures already underway, especially thermoregulation and changes in social life. A less hairy body may have become more favourable, partly because it was already being opened by heat and sweating. Parasite reduction could then amplify the benefit rather than create the change from nothing. The social dimension matters here. Primates are extraordinary groomers, and grooming is among the most important social behaviours in the group. It removes debris and parasites, yes, but it also settles conflict, reinforces rank, strengthens bonds, and creates trust through repeated contact. In a heavily furred animal, grooming is labour-intensive. It takes time and skill to search a coat thoroughly. If a lineage becomes less hairy, the practical side of grooming changes. Parasites become easier to spot. Skin lesions become easier to inspect. Dirt is more obvious. At the same time, touch becomes less about searching through fur and more directly about skin-to-skin contact. This is a subtle but potentially important transformation. The body becomes easier to maintain and easier to read. That does not mean parasite pressure was necessarily strongest where the coat was thinnest, nor that hair loss happened simply because grooming became more efficient. The relationship is messier. A less hairy body may be more vulnerable in some ways, especially to biting flies or mosquitoes that now reach skin more easily. A dense coat can sometimes block access to blood, even if it shelters other parasites. This is one reason the hypothesis remains debated. Different parasites pose different problems. Some are discouraged by less hair, others may be helped by easier skin access. Some diseases are transmitted by fleeting contact rather than long-term residence in the coat. The body is not solving one clean problem. It is navigating a shifting ecology of organisms, each exploiting a slightly different opportunity. But there is at least one famous clue from the parasite world that has drawn unusual attention: lice. Humans today host different lice adapted to different body regions, and the evolutionary history of these parasites provides indirect hints about when body hair changed. Head lice cling to scalp hair, while body lice depend largely on clothing rather than dense body hair, living in garments and moving to the skin to feed. Pubic lice belong to another lineage entirely, one that appears to have shifted to humans from gorillas deep in the past. These details do not solve the origin of fur loss on their own, but they reveal how profoundly the ecology of the human body changed. Parasites evolved along with those changes. They adapted to retained islands of hair, to new social habits, and later to artificial coverings that replaced the protective role of fur. Even before clothing, though, the thinning human body may have altered the disease landscape in smaller but important ways. Fewer sheltered zones for parasites could mean fewer secondary skin infections. Less dense body hair might reduce the persistence of mud, feces, rotting organic matter, or other contaminants close to the skin in hot conditions. A body that sweats heavily and dries repeatedly may benefit from being easier to clean with water, dust, or simple rubbing. In warm climates, cleanliness is not an abstract virtue. It directly affects comfort, infection risk, and the burden carried by children. What survives in the record suggests that once the coat began to thin, other advantages may have accumulated around the more accessible skin surface. There is also a revealing connection between parasites and sleeping arrangements. Ancestral primates often slept in nests or sheltered spots where parasites could accumulate. A heavily furred body resting night after night in the same sorts of environments pays a compounding cost. If early humans began to change where, how, and with whom they slept, parasite exposure may have shifted again. Ground sleeping, shared resting sites, later use of fire, and eventually bedding and shelters all transformed the relationship between body and parasite. Hair reduction may have interacted with these behavioral changes in ways impossible to reconstruct fully. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broader logic holds. Body surface, social contact, and resting ecology all affect parasite pressure, and all were changing somewhere along the human path. Some researchers have also considered whether reduced body hair might have signaled lower parasite load to potential mates or allies. This idea moves the story towards sexual selection, where visible condition becomes socially meaningful. The reasoning is plausible enough a cleaner. Less parasite-ridden body may indicate health, vigor, or attentive care. Yet this remains speculative unless treated carefully. Parasite resistance can certainly influence mate choice in animals, but proving that it drove major human anatomical change is far harder. It is safer to say that once the body became less furry for other reasons, lower visible parasite burden may have become one of several reinforcing benefits. Evolution often strengthens a trend by allowing multiple rewards to gather around it. What makes the parasite hypothesis enduring is not that it explains everything, but that it explains the right kind of detail. Human hair loss does not look like a simple thermal calculation alone. The body is too social, too visible, too behaviorally flexible for that. Parasite pressure belongs naturally inside the broader package because it affects energy, disease, sleep, infancy, grooming, and mate perception all at once. A lineage already experimenting with more exposed skin and more active cooling may have discovered, in evolutionary terms, that fewer hiding places for parasites made the bargain even better. And yet the body does not become cleanly bare. Hair remains in zones where friction, signalling, and protection still matter. Scalp hair persists, even though it can host lice. Eyebrows and eyelashes remain. Later, thick hair returns at puberty in the armpits and groin, precisely where scent, moisture, and intimate contact become socially and sexually significant. This patchwork outcome is another reminder that evolution is not aiming at antiseptic smoothness. It is always negotiating among competing demands. Parasite reduction may favour less hair over much of the body, while other functions preserve it elsewhere. So the exposed human skin is not simply freer than fur, it is differently burdened. It trades one set of vulnerabilities for another, then leans on behaviour, cooperation, and physiology to manage the exchange. Parasites may have helped push the balance away from the old primate coat, especially once heat, movement, and sweating were already making that coat more expensive. But by themselves they are unlikely to explain the whole transformation. They belong to the chorus, not the solo. Still, once the body becomes more visible, more inspectable, and less hidden beneath the general coat, another force gains new room to act. Bodies are no longer only functional objects moving through climate and disease. They are also surfaces that other humans can judge, prefer, and respond to. Skin now shows condition. Hair now remains in strategic places rather than everywhere. Differences can be seen more clearly. At that point, the story of lost fur begins to merge with another ancient and difficult possibility that some of what the human body became was shaped not only by survival, but by desire. Once the human body becomes more visible, evolution is no longer negotiating only with climate, movement, and parasites. It is also negotiating with attention. In a heavily furred mammal, much of the body remains visually generalized. Shape is softened. Skin is concealed. Subtle changes in circulation, condition, and surface quality are harder to detect at a glance. But in a less hairy primate, the body becomes more legible. Skin tone, smoothness, scarring, posture, fat distribution, muscle tension, age, injury, and even momentary physiological states can be read more readily. That change may have opened the door to a different kind of evolutionary pressure, one shaped not by heat or disease directly, but by what members of the species notice, prefer, avoid, and reward in one another. This is the territory of sexual selection, and it has long hovered around the mystery of human hair loss. The idea, in broad form, is simple enough. If less body hair made individuals appear healthier, cleaner, younger, less parasite-burdened, or more reproductively attractive, then mate choice might have favoured reduced hair beyond whatever thermal or hygienic advantages had already begun the trend. Over time, a practical adaptation could become amplified by preference. A body that started becoming less hairy for one reason might continue becoming less hairy because other humans responded positively to the result. There is a certain intuitive appeal to this, because human beings are intensely visual and social animals. They attend to faces, skin, gait, expression, symmetry, and signs of vitality with remarkable sensitivity. Even before language becomes elaborate, bodies communicate. A visible injury warns. A healthy complexion reassures. Youth and maturity signal themselves through hair patterns, skin texture, and bodily proportions. Once fur stops masking so much of that information, the body becomes a display surface whether it intends to or not. Mate choice, alliance, and social ranking all acquire more raw material to work with. In that sense, reduced hair could have made the body more expressive, and a more expressive body may have become more selectable. Still, this is one of the most difficult parts of the story to prove. Scholars still debate how much sexual selection can really explain, because attraction does not leave fossils, and preferences can shift quickly across populations and environments. It is easy to invent a plausible scenario in which smooth skin becomes desirable. It is much harder to show that such desirability drove a species-wide anatomical transformation lasting hundreds of thousands or millions of years. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, and sexual selection is especially vulnerable to becoming a story that sounds neat because it resembles modern human behavior. Deep prehistory demands more caution than that. Yet caution does not mean dismissal. Sexual selection often works not by creating traits from nothing, but by exaggerating or stabilizing traits that already exist for other reasons. The peacock does not invent feathers out of pure display, it elaborates them. In the human case, if thermoregulation, sweating, and parasite pressure had already begun to reduce body hair, then mate preference could plausibly have strengthened that direction. A less hairy body might signal a lower parasite load. It might reveal injuries that had healed well. It might allow fat reserves, pregnancy, developmental maturity, or emotional states to be read more clearly. These are not trivial things in a social species with long childhoods, high parental investment, and complicated cooperative bonds. There is also the matter of neoteny, the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, which some researchers have cautiously linked to human appearance. Compared with many other primates, adult humans retain certain features that can appear more juvenile or softened, including reduced facial projection and a generally less rugged body covering in some regions. A less hairy body may have contributed to this overall impression of prolonged youthful traits, especially in females, and if such traits became associated with fertility, health, or social preference, then selective pressure might follow. But again, the evidence remains incomplete. What survives in the record suggests possibility rather than proof. Sexual selection may have mattered, but exactly how much remains uncertain. One reason the idea remains compelling is that human hair is not merely reduced, it is redistributed in a very peculiar way. Thick hair remains or intensifies in places linked strongly to display, identity, maturity, and social signaling. The scalp keeps a dramatic covering that can vary in color, texture, length, and form. Eyebrows frame the eyes and sharpen expression. Facial hair in adult males becomes a pronounced signal of puberty, status, age, and perhaps hormonal condition. Hair in the pubic and underarm regions appears with sexual maturity and may help retain scent cues. This pattern does not resemble a simple stripping away of all hair wherever possible. It looks more like an evolutionary editing process in which hair remains where it communicates or protects effectively and recedes where it interferes with cooling or other functions. That patchwork outcome is especially suggestive because it blurs the line between survival and display. Scalp hair may help shade the head from solar radiation, but it also becomes a highly visible social feature. Facial hair may offer limited protection, but its role in signaling sex and maturity is unmistakable. Pubic hair may reduce friction and retain scent, but it also marks adulthood. In other words, once body hair stops serving primarily as a general coat, what remains can become specialized not only physically, but socially. Hair is no longer just insulation, it becomes information. This may have changed courtship and mate assessment in profound ways. A more visible body allows individuals to detect health and reproductive condition through skin quality, body composition, and movement. At the same time, localized hair can emphasize maturity and sexual difference. Humans become a species in which the body surface itself carries a growing amount of social meaning. Skin is not hidden beneath fur, and hair is not spread uniformly. Instead, the body presents a complex visual map. Some regions are open and readable, others are marked by retained or newly emphasized hair. That arrangement would have given mate choice far more to work with than in a uniformly coated ape body. But it is important not to overstate how conscious any of this needed to be. Sexual selection does not require modern beauty ideals or reflective preference. It only requires that some traits consistently influence reproductive success because they affect attraction, bonding, or perceived quality. A slightly less hairy individual might be chosen more often not because anyone held an abstract preference for smoothness, but because the body seemed healthier, more groomed, more youthful, less infested, or easier to read. Those responses can be ancient, automatic, and local rather than cultural in the modern sense. Over time, such repeated biases may reshape anatomy even when no one intends them to. There is another subtle possibility here as well. In a less furry species, touch changes, skin contact becomes more direct and more informative. Courtship, bonding, infant care, and comfort all involve exposed surfaces rather than contact filtered through a thick coat. This could have increased the emotional and sexual significance of skin itself. Temperature, texture, moisture, tension, and softness become more immediately legible through touch. A body with less fur is not only easier to see, it is easier to feel. In a species already evolving toward longer pair bonds, cooperative care, and elaborate social life, that may have mattered. Scholars still debate the importance of such factors, but they fit naturally within the broader transformation. And yet one must resist the temptation to treat desire as the master key. Sexual selection can refine, accelerate, or reshape a trait, but it usually works most effectively when other pressures have already opened the path. Human fur loss still makes the deepest sense as part of a system involving heat dissipation, sweating, exposed skin, and changing behavior. Attraction alone is unlikely to have made a vulnerable primate surrender such a valuable mammalian inheritance. But once that surrender was underway, attraction may have helped determine how far it went, how it differed between body regions, and how it became bound up with maturity and identity. The enduring puzzle is that sexual selection is both plausible and elusive. It can explain why the body becomes not merely less hairy, but socially expressive in new ways. It can help account for the curious retention of hair in signal-rich zones. It can make sense of why skin becomes such a powerful site of judgment, care, and desire in human life. But because the evidence is indirect, it must remain one strand among several. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. Human hair loss almost certainly reflects layered causes, with sexual selection joining thermal and ecological pressures rather than replacing them. What seems most likely is that once the coat began to recede, the body crossed a threshold. It ceased to be merely an ape body modified for hotter movement. It became a surface on which human social life could increasingly right itself. Health could be seen more clearly. Maturity could be marked more precisely. Localized hair could signal rather than simply cover. Touch could operate more directly. Attraction could begin to favor bodies already shaped by climate and endurance. The result was not nakedness for its own sake, but a new kind of mammal, one whose skin had become public in ways that fur once prevented. That public skin, however, did not matter only in courtship. It also entered the center of ordinary life. Mothers held infants against it. Companions soothed each other through it. Stress, injury, fever, and effort were read upon it. The less hairy body was becoming not only a better cooling system and a more visible display, but a more intimate social instrument. To understand why that mattered so much, the story has to move closer to the most fragile part of human evolution: children, care, and the long, slow making of social bodies. The human body does not evolve alone. It evolves in arms, on hips, in shade, beside water, against chests, within sleeping groups, under watchful eyes. That is especially true once the body begins to lose the generalized mammalian coat. A less furry animal is not merely a more efficient cooling machine or a more visible social surface. It is also a different kind of parent, a different kind of infant, and eventually a different kind of companion. The shift reaches straight into one of the hardest problems any species faces: how to keep the young alive long enough to matter. For most furry primates, the infant begins life with a practical advantage that humans do not fully retain. Hair gives the young something to cling to, and clinging matters enormously. A newborn primate can often hold on to the mother's coat while she moves, climbs, feeds, and avoids danger. The coat is not only insulation, it is transport infrastructure. It is a surface the infant can grasp and trust. Once body hair becomes greatly reduced, that old arrangement weakens. Human babies are famously helpless by comparison. They do not cling effectively to a maternal coat because there is little coat to cling to. They must be carried more actively, supported more continuously, and watched more carefully. This is often explained mainly through brain size and the immaturity of human newborns, both of which are important. But the loss of a dense body covering may also have played a quiet role in deepening that dependency. That possibility is difficult to prove directly, yet it fits the larger pattern. Human infancy becomes unusually demanding in evolutionary terms. Babies are born neurologically unfinished, physically dependent, thermally vulnerable, and slow to become self-sufficient. A less furry infant body would intensify some of these demands, especially in exposed climates and during movement. Skin loses heat faster than fur. Small bodies dry out faster. Resting comfort is harder to maintain without contact or cover. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the peculiar helplessness of human infants. But what survives in the comparative record suggests that reduced fur would have made active carrying and close bodily care more important than they already were in ape ancestors. That in turn changes the adult body's social obligations. A mother carrying a less self-attaching infant spends more energy. Her hands and arms matter more. Her daily routes, foraging patterns, and risk calculations change. A group that helps with carrying, guarding, or provisioning gains an advantage. In this way, a reduction in fur may have reinforced broader shifts toward cooperative care rather than standing apart as an isolated anatomical quirk. A body that no longer provides its young with a clinging coat may require its society to become more involved in compensation. Evolution often works like this. A trait that increases one difficulty helps drive the emergence of behaviors that solve it. There is also the matter of warmth. Human beings are intensely contact-dependent creatures, especially at the beginning of life. Skin-to-skin contact calms infants, regulates temperature, stabilizes stress, and strengthens attachment. These effects are well known today, but their roots may run deep. Once the body becomes less furry, warmth is mediated less by a continuous insulating layer and more by shared shelter, shared sleep, wrapping, and direct contact. A child pressed against an adult torso gains heat not through clinging to fur, but through the skin itself. In this sense, exposed skin may have become not only a vulnerability but a social resource. It turns the body into a more immediate medium of reassurance and regulation. That idea reaches beyond infancy. A less furry species may live differently in touch. Grooming no longer dominates social contact in the old primate way, because there is less coat to search through, less hidden debris to remove, and less need for prolonged fur maintenance over the entire body. But touch does not diminish. It changes character. Holding, stroking, embracing, patting, leaning, carrying, and direct skin contact all acquire greater importance. The body surface becomes more communicative because it is more exposed. It registers tension, illness, excitement, fatigue, and comfort. It also transmits care more directly. What had once been a furry social animal becomes a skin-based one. This may help explain something subtle but central about human society. Humans are exceptionally sensitive to touch, not merely sexually, but emotionally and socially. Touch soothes, touch bonds. Touch communicates safety where words do not yet exist or fail. A body with reduced fur is not automatically a more affectionate body, of course, but it is a body in which touch is physically more immediate. Heat transfer is more direct. Pressure is more clearly felt. Skin condition is more visible. A social world built around such bodies may gradually treat touch as more significant, because touch is no longer filtered through a thick coat. Scholars still debate how much explanatory weight should be placed on this shift, but it fits naturally within the broader transformation from ape to human. There may also have been a cognitive consequence hidden within this ordinary intimacy. Human social life depends heavily on reading subtle bodily cues. Skin color changes with exertion, injury, fever, fear, shame, or anger. Wounds are more visible. Illness leaves marks. Dehydration alters appearance. Nutritional condition changes contour and texture. Among group-living animals, the ability to detect such signs can affect survival. A less furry body may therefore have made care more informed. A caregiver can see distress sooner. A companion can notice infection, swelling, or weakness more easily. A parent can assess the state of a child with fewer barriers. The body becomes not just exposed, but legible. This legibility may have mattered especially in long childhoods. Human juveniles remain dependent for unusually extended periods, requiring years of feeding, protection, teaching, and emotional regulation. In such a life history, bodies that reveal condition clearly are useful. The young are monitored constantly. The older watch for decline. Injuries are managed before they worsen. All of this is easier when the body is not hidden beneath a uniform pelage. The exposed skin becomes part of the information system of social life. It helps transform a group from a collection of individuals into a network of mutual observation and response. At the same time, Reduced fur imposes costs that only social buffering can cover. Night cold becomes more dangerous, especially for the small and weak. Wind matters more. Rain matters more. Abrasion matters more. The old coat no longer solves these problems passively. Instead, the group must solve them together through nest choice, huddling, shelter use, eventually fire, and much later clothing. What survives in the record suggests that human evolution increasingly ties bodily vulnerability to social intelligence. The body becomes less self-protecting in one sense and more reliant on collective adaptation in another. That may sound like weakness, but it is one of the great human exchanges. Biology gives up a little autonomy, and culture begins to grow into the gap. There is a revealing paradox here. Losing fur should have made humans more fragile, and in many ways it did. Yet that very fragility may have helped intensify cooperation. A species whose young must be carried, whose skin must be protected, whose nights require shared warmth, and whose exposed bodies reveal distress cannot flourish as a loose gathering of minimally involved individuals. It is pushed toward attentiveness. It is pushed toward care. This does not make ancient human life gentle. It remained full of risk, neglect, injury, and death. But it may have made social support more decisive than it had been in a more coat-protected ape existence. The consequences continue into adulthood. Adults too depend on one another in a less furry species. Exhaustion can be seen. Heat stress can be seen. Illness can be seen. Emotional state can sometimes be seen. Body care becomes a visible social act. Hair no longer dominates maintenance over the entire body, so other forms of maintenance rise in importance: washing, rubbing, tending wounds, protecting skin from elements, perhaps applying substances such as clay, ash, fat, or plant materials in some contexts long before complex dress becomes common. The evidence for the earlier such practices is fragmentary, but the logic is straightforward. A skin-based animal must take care of skin. This is one reason the human story cannot be reduced to a list of isolated adaptations. Less body hair affects infant transport, thermal dependence, hygiene, touch, communication, and the visibility of need. Each change strengthens others. More carrying supports helpless infants. More helpless infants strengthen cooperative care. More exposed skin strengthens touch and legibility. Greater legibility improves response to illness and distress. Stronger social buffering makes it safer for biology to remain vulnerable. Evolution then has more room to continue down the path of exposed skin and reduced fur because the group is carrying part of the burden. No single explanation fully accounts for why humans lost their fur, but the pressures of care and social life almost certainly belong inside the answer. Even if thermal regulation began the transition, hair loss would have reshaped the ordinary mechanics of being together. It would have made parenthood harder, touch more immediate, condition more visible, and cooperation more valuable. The human body became a public body in a deeper sense than sexual display alone. It became one that others had to read, soothe, carry, and protect. And still the mystery remains partly hidden, because the very tissues that matter most in this story almost never fossilize. Bone can tell part of the tale, but not the softness of contact, the texture of skin, the degree of infant hairiness, the amount of sweat, or the look of a tired body after hours of heat. To understand those lost realities, scientists must work indirectly, assembling clues from living anatomy, genes, parasites, and physiology. The next part of the story lies there, in the stubborn problem of evidence itself, and in all the ways this ancient transformation left traces everywhere, except in the places one most wishes it had survived. The hardest part of this mystery is that the most important evidence almost never survives. If one wanted to understand the evolution of horns, tusks, or limb proportions, the fossil record would at least offer direct fragments of the answer. Bone keeps its shape with stubborn loyalty. Teeth endure almost offensively well. Footprints can freeze a moment of posture into stone, but fur does not last. Skin does not last. Sweat glands vanish without ceremony. Pigment leaves only indirect echoes. The very features most central to the human transformation disappear first, leaving scientists to reconstruct an evolutionary revolution from the edges of its shadow. That is why the question of how and why humans lost their fur remains so compelling. The body changed in plain view of the world, yet the evidence of that change is among the least likely to fossilize. This forces anthropology, evolutionary biology, and paleontology into an unusual partnership. No single discipline can solve the problem on its own. Fossils provide anatomy, dates, habitats, and the broad sequence of species. Comparative primatology offers living models, imperfect but essential, for how hairy apes regulate heat, groom, carry infants, and manage social life. Genetics reveals mutations and lineages tied to skin, pigmentation, keratin, and gland function. Parasitology contributes the history of lice and other small dependents that evolved alongside human bodies. Physiology explains what sweating can accomplish and what thick fur would prevent. The result is not a simple chain of proof, but a layered reconstruction in which many small clues align around a larger picture. That picture is powerful precisely because it is indirect. Scientists cannot point to a fossil rib and say with confidence that the individual who owned it had a chest with sparse hair and abundant active sweat glands. Instead, they ask broader questions. What kind of environment did this hominin inhabit? How far might it have travelled? What does body proportion suggest about heat exchange? What does the shape of the limb skeleton imply about locomotion? What can be inferred from modern human skin, biology compared with chimpanzees and gorillas? What do genes associated with hair and pigmentation reveal about the timing of later changes? Each question yields only part of the answer. Together, however, they create constraints. They narrow what is plausible and make certain stories stronger than others. One of the most striking lessons from this evidence is how misleading appearance can be. Humans look far less hairy than chimpanzees, yet the number of hair follicles on human skin is not drastically lower. In some respects, it is surprisingly similar. The difference lies in the kind of hair produced and the prominence of that hair, not merely in follicle count. Humans retain countless follicles that now generate short, fine, lightly pigmented vellus hairs rather than the thick terminal hair that creates a visible coat. This is an important clue because it suggests a regulatory transformation rather than simple deletion. The mammalian machinery remains present across much of the body, but its output has changed. Evolution did not erase the whole system, it tuned it downward, selectively and unevenly. That insight fits well with the patchwork geography of human hair. The scalp remains thickly covered. Eyebrows and eyelashes are preserved. Pubic and underarm hair emerge at puberty. Male facial hair can become pronounced. Meanwhile, the limbs, trunk, and much of the torso are comparatively bare by mammalian standards. Such a distribution would be very odd if evolution were pursuing nakedness as a goal in itself. It makes much more sense if different body regions are subject to different functional demands. The fossil record cannot show this directly, but the living human body makes the pattern impossible to ignore. The question, then, is not why hair vanished absolutely. It is why a general coat was downgraded while certain specialized regions kept, or even intensified their growth. Another crucial problem involves timing. When exactly did major human hair reduction occur? Here the evidence becomes especially frustrating. The hominin fossil record gives broad milestones in locomotion, habitat use, and anatomy. But the timing of soft tissue change has to be inferred by association. If enhanced sweating and reduced fur are tied closely to longer distance terrestrial locomotion in hot settings, then one expects major hair reduction to intensify somewhere along the path leading toward more human-like endurance bodies, likely within later Australopiths or early Homo, perhaps deepening further within Homo erectus or its close relatives, but this remains inference. Scholars still debate the pace and sequence, and what survives in the record suggests a process rather than a single threshold. Hair loss may have advanced region by region, population by population, under slightly different local conditions before becoming more firmly established. The genetics of hair itself offer tantalizing but incomplete clues. Genes involved in keratin production, hair growth cycles, and skin differentiation clearly matter, yet tracing a clean evolutionary timeline from living genomes back into deep prehistory is difficult. Many relevant genetic changes are ancient, some are difficult to date precisely, and others may have had multiple functions. A mutation affecting hair form may also affect skin or glands. A later population-specific change can obscure older ones. The genome is a record, but not a diary. It tells us that the machinery of hair and skin has been modified in complex ways, but it rarely hands over a neat calendar of when the ancestral coat began to fail as a coat. This is where comparative anatomy becomes so valuable. Chimpanzees, for all their differences from our ancestors, still offer a living contrast. They are hairy, less dependent on whole-body equine sweating, and less specialized for sustained hot weather terrestrial endurance. Humans are less visibly hairy, far more reliant on evaporative cooling, and far more committed to long-distance bipedal locomotion. The gulf between them is not merely cosmetic, it is systemic. Since both lineages descend from a furred common ancestor, something substantial had to change on the human side. The fossil record alone cannot tell exactly how that happened, but it provides the ecological and anatomical background in which such change becomes plausible. While living bodies reveal the endpoints of the divergence, there is also evidence hidden in anatomy below the surface. Human skin differs from that of chimpanzees and other primates in ways that support a more active thermoregulatory role. The distribution and activity of eccrine glands, the characteristics of the epidermis, the vascular behavior of the skin, and the prominence of subcutaneous fat in certain regions all contribute to a different bodily relationship with the environment. None of this is visible in fossils, yet it belongs to the same suite of traits as reduced body hair. A human body does not merely look less furry, it functions as though the skin itself has been promoted from underlayer to operating surface. That promotion is one of the central facts any explanation must account for. The difficulty, of course, is that indirect evidence can tempt overconfidence. There is always a risk of building a beautiful story that fits the clues too neatly. Paleontologists and anthropologists know this well. A particular hominin species may have had more body hair than expected or less. Populations living in different habitats may have varied. Some traits may have arisen for one reason and later been co-opted for another. The evidence remains incomplete, and the absence of preserved skin or fur means that uncertainty is not a flaw in the research. It is part of the reality being studied. The honest answer is not that scientists do not know anything, but that they know the transformation mostly by its consequences. And those consequences are everywhere. Human skin can sweat in extraordinary quantity. Human pigmentation patterns map onto UV exposure in ways that make sense only for a relatively exposed body. Human infants are carried in ways unlike many furry primates. Human-parasite relationships, especially with lice, reflect a radically altered hair landscape. Human body proportions and endurance abilities suggest a lineage that had to solve heat differently from apes. Human social life invests heavily in touch, visible condition, and skin-based signaling. The lost fur itself is gone, but the world built in its absence remains. In that sense, the evidence is not missing so much as displaced. This is one reason the question continues to invite argument. Researchers can agree on many broad facts and still disagree on the main driver, because each line of evidence points to a different part of the same transformation. Thermoregulation looks decisive from physiology. Parasites look important from ecology and grooming. Social display looks compelling from the visibility of skin and the retention of strategic hair. Infant care and touch matter from the perspective of social evolution. The fossil record, unable to preserve the coat itself, acts more like a framework than a verdict. It shows when bodies changed enough to make new explanations plausible, but not which explanation carried the greatest weight at each stage. So the absence of direct evidence does not leave the story empty, it leaves it distributed. To understand human fur loss, one must read bones for climate and locomotion, genes for pigment and hair regulation, parasites for bodily history, and living skin for ancient function. It is a strangely modern way of solving a prehistoric problem, built from collaboration across fields that would once have seemed unrelated. That alone says something about the transformation itself. Losing fur was not a small cosmetic adjustment. It touched so many systems that no single trace can explain it. And perhaps that is the most revealing clue of all. If the story was simple, the evidence would converge neatly around one obvious cause. Instead, it radiates outward into heat, sunlight, parasites, carrying, display, and cooperation. The missing fur has to be reconstructed from all the things that changed because it was missing. Among the most surprising of those things are the small parasites that stayed with us, adapted with us, and now preserve one of the strangest indirect records of all. In their tiny branching histories, especially in the histories of lice, there may be some of the best clues to when the human body became so different from the coat-covered ape it once was. Some of the most revealing witnesses to human hair loss are creatures no one would choose as companions. They are tiny, persistent, and ancient. They feed in secret, cling to shafts, hide in seams, and travel wherever bodies go. Lice do not care about beauty, symbolism, or the story humans tell about themselves. They care about habitat. Give them the right surface, the right warmth, and access to blood, and they settle in with ruthless professionalism. Change the body, however, and they change with it. This is why their history has become such a strange and valuable source of evidence. When fur disappears, lice cannot pretend otherwise. They must either adapt, relocate, or die. Human beings today host different kinds of lice, and each tells part of the story. Head lice inhabit scalp hair. Pubic lice inhabit coarse hair in the groin, and sometimes adjacent regions. Body lice are the most peculiar of all because they do not truly live on the body in the old mammalian sense. They live mainly in clothing, moving onto the skin to feed and then retreating into fabric seams. That last fact alone reveals how radically human biology and culture transformed the old mammalian arrangement. An ancestral primate coat once served as the broad habitat for body-dwelling parasites. Later, garments begin to replace the missing fur so effectively that some lice evolve to exploit clothing as though it were an artificial pelt. This insight matters because parasites evolve on timescales that can sometimes be estimated. By comparing the genetic divergence of human lice lineages, researchers have tried to infer when certain ecological shifts occurred. Body lice, for example, appear to have diverged from head lice after humans had already lost most of their dense body hair and begun wearing habitual clothing. Estimates have varied, and scholars still debate exact dates and assumptions, but the broad implication is clear. By the time body lice emerge as a distinct lineage, the human body is already too bare to support the kind of general coat habitat that many mammals provide naturally. Clothing, not fur, becomes the replacement environment. That does not date the original loss of fur by itself, but it gives a later marker in the chain. It shows that by the time regular clothing enters the picture, human hair reduction is already an ancient fact. The body has long since crossed the threshold into being a less hairy primate that must outsource part of its protection to culture. Body lice therefore do not solve the origin story directly, but they confirm how complete the transformation became. They also remind us that the disappearance of fur was never absolute in its consequences. The ecological space once provided by body hair did not vanish. It was eventually recreated by fabric, and parasites followed. Pubic lice tell an even stranger tale. Unlike head and body lice, which are closely related to one another, human pubic lice belong to a lineage more closely related to gorilla lice. What survives in genetic comparisons suggests an ancient host switch from gorillas to human ancestors several million years ago. The exact route remains uncertain. It may have involved shared sleeping sites, carcasses, or some other form of close ecological contact rather than anything dramatic or romantic. The important point is that for pubic lice to establish themselves on human ancestors, humans had to offer an appropriate patch of coarse hair habitat, even while much of the rest of the body was becoming a poor environment for such parasites. In other words, the patchwork nature of human hair was already ecologically meaningful. This is one of those lesser-known details that makes the whole story feel more tangible. The human body did not simply become less hairy in a vague general sense. It became a mosaic. Some regions remained suitable for lice specialized to cling to thicker, coarser hairs. Others did not. Scalp hair and pubic hair persisted as biologically distinct islands, each with its own parasite ecology. That pattern strongly reinforces the view that body hair was not erased evenly. Different hair zones retained different functions, and the organisms living on them recorded the difference. Even head lice reveal something about the durability of retained hair. The scalp remains one of the most conspicuously haired parts of the human body, and for good reason. Scalp hair likely helps shield the head from solar radiation while preserving the rest of the body as an efficient evaporative surface. It also creates a stable habitat for lice that could no longer rely on a thick body coat. Head lice are therefore not simply nuisances. They are ecological proof that one part of the mammalian inheritance remained thick enough to host a long-standing parasite community. The scalp was not spared by accident. It remained important enough for protection and perhaps also for signaling that the old relationship between hair and parasite could continue there. Scientists have tried to use these branching parasite histories as clocks, but this requires care. Molecular dating depends on assumptions about mutation rates, population size, and the timing of lineage splits. Those assumptions can shift, and different studies have produced different ranges. The evidence remains incomplete. No single louse lineage can hand over an exact date on which humans lost their fur, yet the value of the parasite evidence lies not only in precision, it lies in pattern. Parasites reveal that the human body's hair landscape changed so dramatically that entire dependent species were forced to reorganize their existence around what remained and around what culture later added. There is something almost poetic in this. The body forgets its coat in the fossil record, but the parasites remember. They remember because their own survival depended on every contour of the change. If a body region kept thick hair, they stayed or shifted there. If a region lost that hair, they abandoned it. If cloth later recreated a warm, fibrous habitat, they colonized that instead. Their tiny evolutionary trees become echoes of the much larger tree of human bodily transformation. They do not explain the motives of evolution, but they preserve the consequences with merciless honesty. This parasite evidence also helps narrow broader questions about timing. If human ancestors acquired pubic lice from gorillas several million years ago, then the hair arrangement that made this possible must already have been taking shape by then or soon after. If body lice split much later, after clothing, then the general body coat had long since ceased to function as their natural habitat. Put together with what is known about locomotion, sweating, and habitat change, these clues suggest that substantial hair reduction was likely well underway deep in the Pleistocene or earlier, perhaps associated increasingly with later Australopiths, early Homo, and especially the expanding ecological role of Homo erectus and related forms. Scholars still debate the exact path, but the parasite record fits a long, staged process better than a sudden late event. The lice story also guards against a common misunderstanding. Humans did not become less hairy because parasites alone forced the issue. If that were true, many other mammals under heavy parasite load might have followed the same path. Instead, the louse evidence is stronger as confirmation than as first cause. It shows that once hair reduction began for thermal, ecological, or social reasons, the parasites had to adapt to the new map of the body. Their history strengthens the case that the transformation was real, regionally specific, and evolutionarily ancient. It does not replace the broader system of explanation. And that broader system grows clearer when all the clues are set side by side. A hotter, more variable, African environment increases the value of efficient cooling. Sweating becomes central. Reduced fur improves evaporation. Dark pigmentation protects exposed skin. Parasite pressure may make the bargain even more favorable. Social life changes as touch, visibility, and care become more skin-centered. Lice and other small dependents track these changes and preserve a fragmentary record of where hair remained. None of these clues stands alone, but together they form a coherent body. The missing fur casts a very large shadow. This is why scholars still resist any answer that sounds too tidy. The human body does not look like the product of one selective event. It looks layered, cumulative, and opportunistic. Evolution solved a heat problem and created a sun problem. It reduced one parasite habitat while preserving others. It exposed the skin and thereby amplified touch, display, and vulnerability. It made infants harder to carry automatically, and may have strengthened cooperative care as compensation. The same change that freed the body to sweat more effectively also forced culture, sooner or later, to step in with shelter, coverings, and artificial warmth. Human hair loss belongs to that whole system, not to one isolated cause. The tiny histories of lice therefore lead toward a larger conclusion. They suggest that by the time the genus Homo is spreading more widely and behaving in increasingly human ways, the body is already profoundly unlike the old ape template. It is no longer a primate merely modified around the edges. It is a skin-based, sweat-driven, selectively haired organism with a body surface entirely redefined. The question is no longer whether one factor explains the change. The question is how much each factor contributed and in what sequence. And that is where the story now turns, to place the leading explanations side by side and see why each captures something real, yet none can claim the whole mystery for itself. By this point, the temptation is almost irresistible to choose a winner. Heat seems persuasive. Parasites seem persuasive. Sexual selection carries its own intuitive force. Social life and infant care deepen the picture. Each explanation arrives with real evidence, real logic, and real pieces of the human body arranged neatly around it. And yet the closer the case is examined, the more obvious it becomes that no single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. Human hair loss does not resemble a simple adaptation with one clean cause. It resembles a convergence, a long evolutionary braid in which several pressures intertwine until the result looks almost inevitable, even though no one thread could have produced it alone. Thermoregulation remains the strongest candidate for the central driver, and for good reason. The human body is built around cooling in a way that the bodies of other apes are not. Heavy eccrine sweating, reduced visible body hair, upright posture, long-distance bipedal locomotion, and the broader architecture of endurance all fit together too well to be accidental. If one asks which explanation best accounts for the largest number of major human traits at once, heat management in hot and variable African environments has the greatest reach. A body that can remain active under severe solar load gains advantages in movement, foraging, scavenging, and eventually hunting. Within such a body, a thick general coat becomes increasingly expensive. This is why most researchers treat thermoregulation not as the whole story, but as the backbone of it. Even so, thermoregulation alone leaves gaps. It explains why fur might become costly, but not necessarily why the resulting body looks quite the way it does. It does not by itself account for the retention of hair in highly specific regions, or for the intensity of human social investment in skin, touch, and visible condition. It does not fully explain why parasite burden may have become easier to manage on a less hairy body, or why localized hair remained available for signaling. A powerful theory can still be incomplete, and heat theory is strongest when it is allowed to be primary without being forced to be exclusive. The parasite explanation enters precisely at this point. It is not persuasive as a lone master key, because many heavily parasitized mammals remain furry. But as a reinforcing pressure, it makes excellent sense. A body already shifting toward more exposed skin for cooling could gain additional benefits if reduced hair also lowered some parasite loads, made infestations easier to detect, or reduced time lost to grooming and irritation. In warm climates where ectoparasites affect sleep, health, and reproduction, that would matter. Parasites do not need to start the whole transformation. They only need to make the new direction more favorable once it begins. This is how evolution often works. A trait first favored for one reason becomes even more useful because other problems also happen to be eased by it. Sexual selection is perhaps the most contested of the major theories because it is both plausible and difficult to test. Once the body became more visible, less generally furred, and more dependent on exposed skin, it almost certainly became easier for conspecifics to read condition, maturity, injury, and possibly parasite burden. Preferences could then begin shaping the body more strongly. Localized hair might acquire new signal value. Smooth or relatively hairless skin might correlate with youth, cleanliness, health, or reproductive status. But scholars still debate how much weight to place on these possibilities because attraction is mutable, context-dependent, and largely invisible to the fossil record. Sexual selection can amplify and refine. It is less convincing as the sole origin of a trait that carries serious thermoregulatory and developmental consequences. The same is true of explanations centered on social touch and infant care. They illuminate something essential about the consequences of hair loss, and perhaps about the pressures that stabilized it, but they probably do not stand comfortably as the initial trigger. A less hairy body changes carrying, skin-to-skin warmth, bodily readability, and the mechanics of care. It may strengthen cooperative behavior by making vulnerability more obvious and touch more direct. But these effects likely grow in importance as the body's already becoming more exposed, not necessarily before. In evolutionary terms, hair loss may begin as a thermal and ecological adaptation, then deepen and become more difficult to reverse because it reshapes social life in useful ways. Once infants are carried differently, once exposed skin becomes central to soothing and communication, once the body is being read and managed through its surface, the new arrangement acquires a social momentum of its own. This layered pattern helps explain one of the most puzzling features of the human body. It is not truly hairless, merely reorganized. If cooling were the only issue, one might expect the body to lose as much hair as possible. If sexual display were the only issue, one might expect more arbitrary variation. If parasite reduction were the only issue, some retained regions might be harder to explain. Instead, the actual body looks like a negotiated settlement. Dense scalp hair remains because shading the head is useful, and because the head is a major display surface. Eyebrows and eyelashes persist because they protect the eyes and sharpen expression. Pubic and underarm hair emerge at maturity because they serve frictional, chemical, and signaling roles. Facial hair in males becomes a potent secondary sexual characteristic. Elsewhere, the coat retreats because it no longer pays for itself against the demands of sweating and heat dissipation. The result is exactly what one would expect from overlapping selective pressures rather than a single motive. There is another reason a multi-cause explanation fits better. Evolution does not act on traits in isolation, and human hair loss clearly sits inside a suite of changes that are themselves interacting. Locomotion changes heat production. Heat production changes the value of sweating. Sweating changes the value of dense fur. Reduced fur changes the risks of solar exposure. Solar exposure changes the value of dark pigmentation. Exposed skin changes parasite ecology and bodily readability. Bodily readability changes social signaling and perhaps mate choice. Reduced infant clinging increases the value of carrying and care. Greater vulnerability increases reliance on social buffering, later shelter, later fire, and eventually clothing. At every step, one adaptation modifies the context in which the next one is judged. Asking for a single cause in such a system may be asking the wrong kind of question. What seems more likely is that the transformation passed through phases. In the earliest phase, changing habitats, greater terrestriality, and increased daytime exposure make heat a rising cost. In the next, enhanced sweating and more efficient cooling begin to favor reduction of a general insulating coat. As exposed skin becomes more prominent, dark pigmentation grows more important, while parasite management may also improve on the less furry body. Then, as the body becomes more visible and socially significant, mate choice, touch, and care begin to reinforce the new design. Later still, cultural buffering through shelter, fire, wrapping, and clothing allows the species to carry this exposed body into climates no mammal with such reduced fur could otherwise tolerate. The process is cumulative, not singular. This face model also explains why precise timing remains so difficult to pin down. Different pressures may dominate at different moments. a region of the body might thin under thermal selection before it later acquires social significance. Another region might retain or even intensify hair because selection there points in the opposite direction. Different hominin species may have represented different balances between coat, sweat, pigmentation, and behavior. Homo erectus, with its broader ecological spread and more human-like body proportions, may have carried the process much farther than earlier Australopiths. But even then, the story need not have ended cleanly. Evolution continues refining traits long after the basic direction is set. A multi-cause explanation is sometimes criticized for sounding vague, as though it avoids commitment. In this case, however, it is not vague at all. It is specific in a different way. It commits to thermoregulation as the strongest overarching pressure while acknowledging that heat alone cannot explain the full human pattern. It recognizes parasite ecology as a meaningful secondary factor without pretending it started everything. It allows sexual selection and social life to matter most where the body's increased visibility and exposed skin make them plausible. It treats human hair loss not as an isolated oddity, but as one element in the emergence of a new mammalian strategy. That strategy is expensive, vulnerable, and remarkably effective. It exchanges passive protection for active cooling, exposed signaling, and increasing cultural dependence. That last point may be the deepest. Human hair loss is one of the clearest examples of biology handing unfinished business to behavior, and then, eventually, to culture. A less furry body works brilliantly in hot environments when paired with water, shade, social support, and later artificial coverings. It works poorly in the cold without compensation. It invites sun damage unless pigmentation adjusts. It makes infants harder to manage unless care systems intensify. Every solution creates a dependency. That is one reason the trait seems so human. It is not self-contained. It reaches outward, requiring planning, cooperation, and eventually technology. The body becomes more effective in one niche precisely by becoming less complete on its own. So there is no final courtroom verdict in which one theory stands and all others are dismissed. The human body does not deliver that kind of simplicity. Instead, it presents a consistent message: the fur was lost, because the costs of keeping it began to outweigh the benefits across several interconnected domains of life. Heat may have started the arithmetic, sweat changed the terms, sunlight required a new skin response. Parasites made the old coat less attractive. Social life made exposed skin more useful and more meaningful. Culture later stabilized the whole arrangement. The explanations are not rivals so much as layers of the same transformation. And this layered transformation leaves one last question before the story begins to widen toward the present. If the general coat became such a burden, why did evolution keep any substantial hair at all? Why spare the scalp, the eyebrows, the lashes, the beard, the intimate regions? The answer lies in the fact that humans did not evolve toward bareness. They evolved toward specialization. The hair that remained was not left over by accident. It was the part still worth keeping. The human body did not abandon hair, it reassigned it. That is one of the clearest signs that evolution was not chasing nakedness for its own sake, nor simply shedding a useless inheritance. If hair had become nothing but a burden, it would have vanished more completely and more evenly. Instead, it remains wherever it can still justify its cost. The pattern is selective, practical, and sometimes socially amplified. The general coat fades, but islands of dense growth survive because those islands still do something the exposed body needs. What looks at first like a half-finished transition is really a map of priorities. The scalp is the most obvious example, and perhaps the most important, a large upright primate moving under strong sun faces a special problem at the top of the body. The head houses the brain, an organ intolerant of overheating and metabolically expensive even at rest. A dense covering over the scalp can reduce direct solar load on the cranium, while the rest of the body remains more open to evaporative cooling. This arrangement is elegant in its compromise. A thick coat over the trunk would interfere with sweat-based heat loss, where large muscle groups are generating heat. A cap of hair over the skull, by contrast, can provide shading without burdening the entire cooling system. This helps explain why the scalp keeps what the shoulders and chest largely surrender. Scalp hair may also have other advantages. It can reduce minor abrasion, soften exposure to wind and dust, and perhaps help channel sweat away from the face depending on its texture and direction. Different hair forms may alter these effects somewhat, and the evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how various ancestral textures functioned under different climates. Even so, the deeper point holds. Scalp hair is not an accidental remnant. It is retained where the trade still works. That is one reason it becomes such a conspicuous feature of human identity later on. A trait preserved first for practical reasons can become a powerful social and aesthetic surface once culture begins to elaborate it. Eyebrows and eyelashes make the same point on a smaller scale. Neither covers much area, but both solve very specific problems. Eyelashes help protect the eye from dust, debris, and excessive airflow, acting as a sensory and physical barrier at one of the body's most exposed and delicate openings. Eyebrows help divert moisture, including sweat and rain, away from the eyes while also shading the orbit slightly. They are tiny ridgelines of retained hair, modest in size but disproportionately valuable. At the same time, both play unmistakable roles in expression. Brows sharpen the face. They frame emotion, intention, skepticism, alarm, concentration, and surprise. A less furry primate face becomes far more readable, and the retention of eyebrows helps make that readability even richer. Facial hair in adult males presents a more complicated story because its functions are less purely practical and more obviously tied to sexual maturity and social signaling. Beards can provide limited protection to the jaw and lower face, and they may slightly alter thermal exchange or sun exposure in localized ways, but their real significance appears elsewhere. They emerge under androgen influence and therefore advertise hormonal status, adulthood, and sex difference. Across many human societies, facial hair becomes tangled with age, prestige, threat, wisdom, disorder, masculinity, and identity. Though the exact meanings vary enormously, the evolutionary foundation likely predates those cultural layers. Male facial hair persists because it communicates. Once the body's general coat is gone, hair retained on the face can shift from insulation to signal. The same is true, in another register, for pubic and underarm hair. These regions do not retain thick hair by accident. They are zones of friction, moisture, scent, and intimate contact. Hair there may reduce skin-on-skin abrasion during movement and sex. It may help disperse or retain chemical signals associated with apocrine glands, which become active around puberty and contribute to adult body scent. It also marks maturity itself. A child does not yet bear these signs. An adult does. In this way, retained hair becomes part of the life history map of the body. It appears when reproductive maturity appears. It transforms the body into an adult social body, legible in ways that matter to mates and rivals alike. This regional specialization is one of the strongest pieces of evidence against simplistic theories. If thermoregulation alone were the whole story, one might expect any hair that impeded cooling to disappear, especially in zones such as the underarms where sweating is significant. But evolution is not optimizing a single variable, it is balancing several at once. Hair can interfere with heat loss and still be retained because it serves another useful role in signal chemistry, friction management, or sexual identification. Likewise, hair can remain on the scalp even if a bare skull might slightly improve evaporative cooling, because protection from direct solar radiation matters more there. The body is always negotiating, never solving only one problem. What survives in the anatomy of hair itself reinforces this impression of specialization. Human scalp hair can grow to unusual length relative to that of most mammals, suggesting that the growth cycle in this region was modified in distinctive ways. This makes the scalp not only a protective cap but a uniquely visible canvas. Texture, thickness, color, and arrangement become highly variable within and between populations. Later on, culture turns those differences into one of the richest fields of human self-expression. But even before culture elaborates them, the biological fact remains striking. The body gave up the general coat and then preserved one region where hair could remain prominent, modifiable and unmistakably human. There may also be a deeper social irony here. As generalized body fur declined, the remaining hair became more symbolically charged precisely because it was no longer everywhere. In a furred mammal, hair is mostly infrastructure. In humans, retained hair becomes punctuation. It marks the head, the eyes, the maturity of the body, the difference between child and adult, male and female averages, kin resemblance, age, and personal condition. Once the body ceases to be broadly covered, every surviving patch becomes more meaningful. Evolution may not care about symbolism, but symbolism flourishes where evolution has created contrast. This is why modern human attitude toward hair are so elaborate and often contradictory. People cherish scalp hair, cut it, cover it, decorate it, or remove it under certain circumstances. They cultivate beards or shave them away. They celebrate thick brows, reshape them, or thin them. They remove underarm and pubic hair in some cultures while emphasizing it in others. These later practices are cultural, not evolutionary causes, but they reveal how the ancient biological redistribution of hair created a body surface unusually open to interpretation. The retained hair is useful, yes, but it is also available. It can be managed, stylized, and judged, because it is sparse enough to stand out and localized enough to be manipulated. The less obvious side of this is that the body kept fine hair almost everywhere else as well. The trunk and limbs are not truly naked. They are covered in short, light, often barely visible hairs that still serve tactile and protective roles on a smaller scale. These hairs can help detect movement on the skin, contribute slightly to barrier function, and preserve a faint reminder of the old mammalian arrangement. This matters because the transformation was not all or nothing. Human skin remains a modified mammalian skin, not a complete break from mammalian biology. The follicles are still there. The capacity for hair remains. It is the expression that changed. That lingering capacity also explains why hairlessness in humans varies. Some individuals and populations grow more body hair than others. Hormones, ancestry, sex, and age all affect the extent and visibility of growth. Yet even at the hairier end of the human range, the body still does not reconstruct a true mammalian coat. The pattern stays within the human design, reduced general coverage, specialized retention, and a body fundamentally organized around exposed skin and sweating. Variation occurs within that framework, not outside it. No single explanation fully accounts for why these particular regions were spared in exactly the ways they were, but the broad answer is clear. Hair remained where it still performed work that exposed skin could not fully replace. It stayed on the scalp to protect the head, around the eyes to protect the eyes and enrich facial communication, in sexually mature regions to reduce friction and support signaling, on male faces to advertise maturity and hormonal state. Elsewhere, the cost-benefit balance shifted too far in favor of cooling, visibility, and skin-based function. The coat became an archipelago. By the time this specialized pattern is established, the human body is unmistakably its own thing. It is no longer simply a furred primate under pressure, nor merely a naked ape in the crude sense. It is a selectively haired, socially legible, sweat-driven mammal whose remaining hair has become strategic. That strategy will follow humans everywhere. It will travel into deserts, forests, coastlines, mountain corridors, and eventually Ice Age latitudes the body was not originally built to inhabit. And there the old trade will reveal its final irony. The species that lost its protective coat will survive not by regrowing it, but by inventing substitutes: shelter, fire, skins, weaving, cloth, architecture, and climate control will all become ways of compensating for an ancient biological bargain. The lost fur, in a sense, never truly vanished. Humans have been trying to rebuild it ever since. The old coat is gone, but the story does not end in prehistory. It continues every time a human shivers in the wind, sweats through a shirt, seeks shade at noon, wraps a child in cloth, builds a roof against the cold, or studies the mirror and wonders why so much meaning still clings to hair and skin. The loss of fur was not just an ancient anatomical adjustment. It was one of the great commitments of the species, a decision written not by intention but by selection, and it still shapes nearly every ordinary moment of human life. To understand that is to see the modern body not as a finished product, but as the surviving edge of an old evolutionary gamble. That gamble gave humans extraordinary freedom in some environments. A sweating, largely exposed body can travel, work, and endure in heat with a competence rare among large mammals. It can cross hot ground after other animals have retreated. It can cool a burdened body in motion rather than only at rest. It can remain socially expressive, visually legible, and physically responsive through skin that is not hidden beneath a thick general coat. These are not minor advantages. They helped build a creature capable of wide-ranging, persistent effort, intimate touch, complex care, and eventually global expansion. The body that lost its fur became, in one very important sense, more available to the world. And yet every gain carried a debt. An exposed body is a needy body. It needs shade, water, and rest in heat. It needs pigmentation or protection against ultraviolet damage. It needs warmth at night and shelter in cold weather. It needs more direct care when the young are small. It needs ways to replace the missing insulation when climate turns hostile. This is where the story becomes unmistakably human, because few species compensate for biological vulnerability the way humans do. Most mammals solve the problem of exposure by evolving better fur, thicker fat, or different body size. Humans solve it increasingly through behavior, cooperation, and technology. They do not regrow the coat, they build one. That process begins earlier than many modern people realize. Even before tailored clothing or permanent architecture, ancestral humans likely used shade strategically, huddled for warmth, selected sheltered sleeping places, exploited caves and overhangs when available, and later mastered fire. Fire, once controlled, did not merely cook food and ward off predators. It extended the day, softened the night, and helped compensate for a body no longer fully protected by hair. Warmth that other mammals carried on the skin could now be generated outside it. In that sense, technology did not simply improve human life, it stepped into a gap opened by evolution. The body became less self-sufficient in one way, and more culturally dependent in another. Clothing deepened that shift dramatically. Once hides, wraps, woven materials, and fitted garments became regular parts of life. Humans began to reconstruct externally what the mammalian coat had once provided internally. Fabric trapped air the way fur trapped air. It shielded skin from wind, abrasion, and insects. It preserved warmth during sleep and travel. Later it became adornment, identity, modesty, rank, and ritual. But beneath all that culture sat an old biological truth. Clothing is portable fur made by hands. It is the artificial continuation of a problem evolution left half solved. The fact that body lice eventually made a home in garments says this more bluntly than any metaphor could. The parasites knew that clothing had become the new pelt. This dependence on artificial protection allowed humans to spread into climates the exposed body was never originally built to inhabit. Tropical skin and sweat could not by themselves conquer Ice Age Eurasia, high mountain winters, or subarctic nights. Fire, shelter, sewn clothing, group planning, and food storage made that possible. The species did not reverse its hair loss in the cold. It externalized the solution. That is a profoundly human move. Time and again, instead of waiting for the body to change enough on its own, humans alter the environment around the body. The ancient loss of fur may therefore be one of the earliest examples of the larger human pattern, biological incompleteness answered by cultural invention. The legacy reaches far beyond climate. Human skin remains one of the most socially charged surfaces in the animal kingdom, because it is both exposed and meaningful. It reveals health, age, stress, injury, and sometimes emotion. It receives decoration, scarification, paint, cosmetics, tattoos, jewelry, perfume, and endless judgment. Hair, too, precisely because it became sparse and strategic rather than universal, turned into one of the most manipulable signs of identity. The scalp, beard, brows, and body hair all became canvases on which culture could write class, sex, mourning, rebellion, holiness, beauty, belonging, and exclusion. None of that was predetermined in detail by evolution, but evolution created the conditions. It gave humans a body surface unusually open to interpretation. This is one reason the biological mystery still feels intimate. It is not only a question about fossils and climates. It touches things people notice every day without thinking. Why does sweat matter so much? Why is touch so immediate? Why does the sun nourish and harm? Why does body hair remain in some places and not others? Why are infancy and caregiving so physically demanding? Why do humans live so uneasily between exposure and protection, forever adjusting temperature, covering skin, uncovering skin, celebrating hair, removing hair, hiding from weather, chasing weather, and surrounding the body with substitutes for what it once surrendered? The answer is not hidden in one event. It lies in the whole evolutionary bargain. What survives in the scientific record suggests that bargain was struck gradually and under several overlapping pressures. Heat likely carried the greatest weight. Efficient sweating made a dense general coat increasingly costly. Exposed skin then demanded dark pigmentation in ancestral tropical populations. Parasite burdens may have become easier to manage on a less hairy body. Social life grew more skin-centered, more tactile, and more visually responsive. Hair remained where it still performed essential or signal-rich work. Later, culture stabilized the arrangement and carried it far beyond its original ecological limits. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation, but together they describe something rare in nature, a mammal that traded passive bodily protection for active environmental mastery. Even now the trade is unfinished. Modern humans live in climates controlled by glass, concrete, heating systems, and air conditioning, yet the old body persists beneath it all. It still overheats, it still chills, it still flushes, blisters, scars, tans, itches, and sweats. It still relies on close care at the beginning of life and on social buffering throughout it. In hospitals, deserts, offices, refugee camps, mountain trails, cities, and tropical fields, the same ancient design remains visible. People inhabit technological worlds, but they do so in a body made for movement, sun, touch, and exposure. The lost fur is never fully forgotten because the body never stops behaving as though it once had it. Perhaps that is why the human form can seem at once powerful and unfinished. It is a body built not to stand alone, but to be completed by habits, by relationships, by fire, by cloth, by walls, by memory, by ingenuity. It is a body that reveals the species in miniature. Humans thrive not because biology solved every problem in advance, but because biology left problems open, and the species learned to answer them together. Losing fur was one of those open problems. It created vulnerability, but also possibility. It made humans colder at night and more enduring by day. It stripped protection from the skin and turned the skin into a sophisticated organ of cooling, signaling, and contact. It forced the species to become inventive because it could no longer rely on the old mammalian certainty of the coat. So the mystery ends where human history begins, with a body no longer fully sheltered by itself, standing in the world with dark exposed skin, sweat on the surface, hair retained only where needed, and survival increasingly tied to what can be built, carried, shared, and remembered. The fur was not simply lost, it was exchanged for another way of being an animal, a dangerous way, expensive and incomplete, but astonishingly successful. The coat vanished, and in its place came endurance, touch, visibility, culture, and a species forever learning how to cover itself by other means. The wind drops with the light, and the ground begins to give back the heat it borrowed all day. The skin cools first. The old mammalian answer would have been a coat waiting there already, soft and silent, trapping warmth close to the body without thought, without effort, without fire or cloth or walls. Humans no longer carry that answer. They carry memory of it instead, distributed into habits so ordinary they hardly seem like memory at all. A hand reaches for fabric. A child is gathered closer. A shelter is entered. A flame is lit. The missing fur returns, not as biology, but as behavior. That may be the most revealing part of the story. Human evolution did not simply produce a smarter ape. It produced a body that needed the world differently. A body that sweats instead of panting, that exposes its skin instead of hiding beneath a pelt. That depends on shade, pigment, water, care, and eventually invention. A body more open to heat, more open to touch, more open to damage, more open to being read by others. In losing its coat, it became more vulnerable, but also more social, more dependent, but also more adaptable. The old protection was given up, and in its place came a long partnership between flesh and culture, somewhere in Africa, over spans of time too large for memory. That exchange began without announcement, No generation saw the whole transformation. No ancestor knew it was becoming the kind of creature that would one day sew garments, paint walls, sleep beneath blankets, and argue over the meaning of hair and skin. There was only pressure, season after season, body after body, each one carrying a slightly altered balance between exposure and survival. Sweat brought a little more motion. Dark skin brought a little more safety under the sun. Social care brought a little more protection for the vulnerable. Hair remained where it still mattered and faded where it no longer could justify itself. And then, very slowly, the human shape emerged, not naked in the simple sense, and not finished in the way modern imagination often prefers, but exposed in a new way, unfinished in a productive way, open to the world and therefore forced to answer it. That is what the lost fur really left behind, not emptiness, but a space. Into that space came warmth shared between bodies, shade chosen wisely, coverings stitched from other animals, houses raised against weather, and all the quiet human arts of protection that followed. So the story closes not with absence, but with a figure at dusk, skin cooling in the evening air, hair still catching the last light on the head and brows. The rest of the body bearing the ancient mark of a bargain struck long ago. Around that body gather all the things humans made because the coat was gone. Fire, cloth, shelter, company, and beyond them, the darkening landscape where other mammals still wear the inheritance humans set aside. The wind moves over them too, but only one species learned to replace its fur with a world.